Chapter 49 Purchase order spending 10 contribution points but not a spell to show for it, Suemo felt like a fool. Enraged, Suemo raised his head to look at the decrepit building before marching away without a second glance. Humph, when ye has contribution points, ye will lie down on the first floor, lie down on the second, sleep every day here. Suemo didn't feel good but was helpless. Very quickly, his brain turned to how to earn Jingshi. The contribution points of inner sect disciples were not easy to earn. Previously, when he had been an outer sect disciple, he had never been troubled by contribution points. But then he turned around his thinking. The contribution points of inner sect disciples were much more valuable than outer sect disciples. Before, no matter which jade scroll from the second level, he would treat it like a treasure. When would he be so picky? There were many ways to earn contribution points. Just the ling grasses and herbs that Suemo planted, and then if the sect sold them, they all would have contribution points. However, rules like the records room, Suemo guessed, were common and there would be other places that would need to use contribution points. This question was very important and he needed to be clear. He ran to the Hall of Hearing Principles and found Sui Shixiang. After hearing Suemo's words, Sui Shixiang explained, Shidi thought correctly. Contribution points are more useful than Jingshi in the sect. Other than Void Sword Scripture, all the other spells in the sect, including Masters, Ice Dragon Sword Scripture, and the other 4th grade sword scriptures can all be exchanged using contribution points. Of course, the amount of contribution points needed is astonishing. Other than spells, some high-quality items, like flying swords and talismans, can also be exchanged using contribution points. You can even use your contribution points to get my master to teach you the sword or forging. I can also pay using contribution points to let Shirgu teach me danmaking. Basically, contribution points are omnipotent in the sect. Then how does Shixiang earn contribution points? Suemo asked. I usually make some talismans for the sect for Yen Lushirshu to sell. Or I forge talismans for the other Shidi in exchange for some contribution points. If Shidi needs some talisman in the future, come find me. My price is much lower than the sect. Sui didn't give up a change to promote his own talismans and continued, like Shidi, if you become skilled at danmaking in the future, it would be very fast to earn contribution points. For other people, Luoli Shidi might only be Zhuji but he has achieved, empty sword, and his attack power can compare to a cultivator in the initial stages of Ningmai. Most of his time is spent in the mines guarding the Shio slaves. Underground is dark and uncomfortable, extremely dull. Other than Luoli Shidi, no one is willing to go so the contribution point that the sect gives him is extremely high. When Sui Shixiang mentioned Luoli, Suemo remembered something. In the second floor of the records room, I didn't see empty sword scripture and shapeless sword scripture. Shidi is in too much of a rush. These 2 sword scriptures, while they are 3rd grade, but they are the finest among the 3rd grade. It is also possible to find the shadow of void sword scripture from those 2. The sect naturally is very cautious. When Shidi has spent more time in the sect, naturally you will be able to exchange for it. Suemo understood. Leaving Sui Shixiang's place, Suemo had a general idea of what he needed to do. It wasn't easy receiving contribution points in the sect. It seemed that his only realistic method right now was relying on planting ling plants. When he got to the entrance to the valley, he saw Liang Feng Shiji. He hurriedly greeted, why hasn't Shiji gone in? The Jinji on Shidi's valley is very heavy. Shiji doesn't want to be too presumptuous. Liang Feng joked. Suemo's heart jumped. Due to the fact that there was a ling vein beneath the rock room, he was very cautious and had set down layers of Jinji at the mouth of the valley. Looking at it now, it seemed very risky as it caught people's attention. He forced himself to calm, responding, there are many ling grasses growing inside the valley. I'm afraid that some animals like rabbits and foxes would get it and damage the grasses. Then this little brother won't even have the time to cry. That's true. Li Yingfeng nodded. If Ling grasses are ruined by those little animals, they wouldn't be worth anything. I actually have a jade scroll right now about Jinji. I'll send it over to Shidi since you can use it. Zhua Mo was overjoyed and gave a deep bow. Many thanks, Shiji. Shidi is too polite. She replied, you and I both came up from the outer sect. It's rational for us to give mutual support. Of course. Zhua Mo agreed. Both of them were clever people. This conversation quickly set down their relationship as allies. It might appear that everyone was good to him on the surface, but inner sect disciples that came from outer sect disciples usually would be pushed aside by the other inner sect disciples. Not just Wukong Sword Sect, almost all sects were like this. There weren't many second-generation disciples in Wukong Sword Sect and most of them were outside. Other than Luo Li and Hao Min, eldest Shixiang Qin Cheng, eldest Shiji Gong Sun Qing and third Shiji Su Yixia were all not in the sect. The battle over eldest Shixiang between Wei Sheng and Qin Cheng was undoubtedly the focal point. If nothing unexpected happened, it was almost set in stone that Wei Sheng would supplant Qin Cheng as eldest Shixiang. But Qin Cheng was also a disciple of the sect leader, and after being eldest Shixiang for this many years, he was well loved by the other second-generation disciples. Eldest Shiji Gong Sun Qing supposedly was engaged to a disciple in a certain large sect. She wouldn't be spending too much time in the sect, but her influence in the sect was the greatest among all second-generation disciples. She could even influence the sect leader. This was probably due to her fiancé. Third Shiji Su Yixia was deeply loved by all the Shirshu. Yan Le Shirshu had meant for her to take over his work. However, her personality was lively and carefree, uninterested in business. Zhua Mo sighed ruefully. No place was spared from conflict. Many times, it wasn't a question of whether you fought or not. He and Li Yingfeng weren't unfamiliar with these matters. The outer sect disciples fought even more viciously, the little groups as plentiful as trees in a forest. Both of them were experienced. Zhua Mo had went from being bullied by all at the beginning to the end where everyone flattered him. From an outsider perspective, his experiences went deep. And Li Yingfeng, to become the top dog of the Eastern Peak female disciples, there were no doubts to her abilities. Zhua Mo saw it very clearly. Wei Xing Shixiang might be the leader of the three of them, but on these matters, Shixiang wouldn't pay attention. Other than the sword, Shixiang was indifferent and unconcerned with other matters. Zhua Mo was certain that Shixiang would be happy not to be eldest Shixiang. That way, he could concentrate on cultivation. Shixiang might not have to consider these things, but he couldn't not consider. Shixiang's talents and power was displayed there. Even Qin Cheng would treat Shixiang with the utmost respect. But Li Yingfeng and his circumstances would be much trickier. There was a large difference between good and bad. Li Yingfeng was also very satisfied with the tacit understanding between the two of them and thought inside, this Zhua Mo Shidi's appearance might be frightening, but he had a clever heart. A clever companion was much better than a stupid one. Some things only need to be touched upon. She changed the topic, coming this time, it's to deliver Jingshi to Shidi. This was undoubtedly the words that Zhua Mo liked to hear the most. He instantly became alert. Oh, how much? This is 76 second grade Jingshi. That's after taking away the down payment. Li Yingfeng handed Zhua Mo a jade scroll. This has the detailed accounts. Shidi can take it back for a look. Zhua Mo took the jade scroll, his happiness unrivaled. The profit this time far surpassed his expectations. Suddenly remembering a matter, Li Yingfeng asked, does Shidi still have some of the Great Strength Pill? Great Strength Pill. If Li Yingfeng hadn't mentioned it, Zhua Mo had almost forgotten that Ling Dan. Last time, a cultivator had brought it. 2 days ago, he came asking if there was any more. He wants to buy another 10. Each one 20 pieces of second-grade jingsha. Li Yingfeng said. 10 pills. Each one 20 pieces of second-grade jingsha. In total, 200 pieces of second-grade jingsha. That was 2 third-grade jingsha. Suemo seemed to see countless jingsha flying towards him. This was the biggest order he had received up until now. 2 pieces of third-grade jingsha. The raw materials for great strength pill were only 3 pieces of second-grade jingsha. With 20 pieces of second-grade jingsha as the sale price, the profit from one pellet reached 17 pieces of second-grade jingsha. No wonder his heart was beating so frantically. His only worry right now was the success rate. He had accidentally made great strength pill. He wasn't certain that he could successfully make it. I'll try first. He was still very cautious. Okay. If shitty gets results, tell me anytime. Finishing, Li Yingfeng left. Seeing Shiji leave, Suemo instantly rushed into the valley, flipped onto the gray-beaked goose to rush for fragrant ginger yard. One pill was 20 pieces of second-grade jingsha. This was almost half of his income every year in the past. Entering fragrant ginger yard, he brought a pile of materials to make the great strength pill from Su Qing Shiji, and then burrowed into the Dan room. Nothing would make him more enthusiastic than jingsha. He didn't start the process immediately but sat down first and thought back to every action that occurred last time. When his emotions had calmed down, he then folded his legs to enter meditation and started embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. 4 hours later, he woke up from meditation. The face was frozen like it was dead, but the eyes were clear and serene. Suomo's mind was peaceful, completely absent of the glee he had before. His consciousness, mind and Ling energy were all at their best. Putting the raw materials for great strength pill into the cauldron, Suomo's hands touched the 8 trigrams plate and his consciousness silently spread out. Adding in Ling energy, the Li fire seal formation on the Dan-making cauldron suddenly started, the Ling energy inside the cauldron twisting and turning. In the middle of the process, Suomo's spell changed and, Art of Crimson Flame, was cast at full force. A gold line dropped into his hands from the sky. Then its direction was deflected and it entered the cauldron. Up until now, nothing was different compared to last time. Suomo's heart relaxed slightly. Just before, when he had thought back to every action in great detail but last time, it had basically been an accident that had created this strange Ling Dan. He was muddled about many places and didn't remember clearly. Suddenly, his heart jumped and he cried misfortune. The Ling energy inside the cauldron was vibrating abnormally. As expected, a sharp and burnt smell spread through the Dan room. Suemo had made enough mental preparations. It wasn't too difficult to accidentally make a new kind of Ling Dan. What that needed was luck. But to actually grasp the method for making the Ling Dan, that was knowledge. Anything that required study, it had to be built from the ground up, there were no tricks. He knew the general idea, the basic steps, and the raw materials. There was also enough profit. Was there anything other than this that was more appropriate for a greenhorn like Suemo? As to the difficulties involved, Suemo wasn't afraid. In this world, was there something good that would earn jingsha without any difficulty? Chapter 50, Finding the Way. After 3 continuous failures, Suemo had to stop experimenting. Even though he had sufficient wealth at this point, but it wasn't enough for him to squander it. He had to plan it out and spend wisely. 3 continuous failures. That meant there was a crucial step that he had missed. He entered into deep thought. What he didn't know was that the difficulty of this matter far surpassed the limits of what he could cope with. He had swallowed down some records, but in the area of Dan making, he was the newest of the new, his experience was almost zero. Going through speculations to find the basic changes in a certain part of the Dan making process, many cultivators that were far more experienced may not be able to do it. But no one had told Suemo this point. If Suemo knew this, he most likely would have thrown the matter to the side. Why was he making great strength pill? It was for Jingshi. If it was too difficult, the risk too high, it wasn't profitable. Then he should go to find a more realistic method. He wasn't afraid of difficulty, he was afraid that his ignorance and those questions that were far out of his level would be tangled together. In Zhuo Mo's eyes, that was an unprofitable business. But Zhuo Mo hadn't realized that the problem he was facing was out of his range. He twisted his brain as he thought in the Dan room. In the sword cave, not even the fingers on a hand could be made out. The rock underneath the feet was ice cold, the blood river not far away roiled relentlessly. Wei Xing panted heavily and couldn't persevere any longer, falling to the ground to enter mediation. The exhaustion between his brows were unable to be disguised. He made a sorry figure, half naked, about 10 or so scars crisscrossing, alarming to the eye. On his lower half, there was only a short length of pants. He quickly entered mediation, almost immediately after sitting down. In meditation, Wei Xing's spine was as straight as a sword, a few hints of dignity and imposingness faintly appearing through his serene appearance. Time slipped away yet he remained motionless. A black shadow quietly neared Wei Xing. In mediation, Wei Xing did not detect it. Suddenly, the black shadow leapt at Wei Xing. In mediation, Wei Xing unexpectedly opened his eyes. With an unknown move, a green sword energy flashed in the dark and the shadow was split in half. Squeak! The scream the black shadow gave was dissonant as it turned into black smoke and disappeared without a trace. Wei Xing stood up from the cold rock ground, his face unaffected. In his eyes were an eternal resolve. Barely visible was sword essence roiling behind. In the silence and darkness, he raised his bare foot, following the blood river, as he slowly and steadily headed deeper. In a place extremely far away from Tianyujie. Stars in daytime, yes. This matter has alarmed many people. There are already many that are rushing to investigate in Tianyujie. Some people say that stars in daytime is a great treasure appearing. Great treasure appearing. The person who spoke had heavy disdain, people die for wealth, bird die for food. This rationale is unchanging. Then we, send someone. Pay attention to this matter. The person who spoke gave an unquestionable order. Yes. In the fragrant ginger yard of Wukong Mountains, seeing Shifeng Rong come out of the Dan room, Su Qing hurriedly followed. She could become the first seat of the outer sect disciples of Fragrant Ginger Yard. One point was she was obedient and could listen, and she was reliable at her job. The other important reason was that she could tolerate Shifeng Rong's strange temper. Shifeng Rong looked at the surroundings and furrowed her brows. Where's your Xixiang? Su Qing hurried responded, after Xixiang entered the Dan room a few days ago, he hasn't come out. Dan room? What Dan is he making? Shifeng Rong's brow smoothed as she asked casually. It seemed that Zhuo Mo was really focused on Dan making. She was very satisfied. It's probably fasting pills. Xixiang had bought some materials for fasting pills from me a few days ago. Su Qing answered. She had been at Fragrant Ginger Yard for a long time and her experience in the area of Dan was much deeper than Zhuo Mo, fasting pills. Shifeng Rong's brows furrowed again as she said discontent, why is he still making fasting pills now? How can he improve that way? Fasting pills were the most basic Dan. It couldn't even be considered a Ling Dan. As a Zhuji cultivator, it was a very comical thing to spend effort on that. Su Qing's heart jumped and she regretted what she had just said. If Xixiang was punished by Shishu because of what she said, it would be bad for her. As she spoke, Shifeng Rong moved in front of the door to Zhuo Mo's Dan room. Without knocking, she pushed open the door. Once the door was open, a thick and choking burning smell rushed out. Shifeng Rong's expression became even uglier. Failure at making fasting pills. Was it that the 5 fasting pills last time had been brought to deceive her? Her expression became dark. Suemo was like a puppet, blankly sitting on the ground. He didn't even notice Shi Fengrong and Su Qing entering. Shi Fengrong noticed that Suemo's empty eyes were full of blood and the rage inside slightly decreased. She could see that Suemo was deep in thought. Suppressing the fire inside, she didn't disturb Suemo, walking straight to the waste piled beside the cauldron. It really was the materials for fasting pills. She was sure after one look. The rage inside instantly shot up again. She decided that later she would have Suemo make one in front of her. Her gaze was just going to move away from the waste when it suddenly stopped. She bent down and started to flip through the waste, and occasionally took up a bit to examine carefully. Su Qing was so envious. She sighed. Inner sect disciples were really inner sect disciples. She had spent so many years at Fragrant Ginger Yard, but had never seen Shishu been this concerned for another disciple. Suemo only managed to wake up at this time. Seeing that 2 more people were in his Dan room, the fire that had formed due to his struggles shot up. It was common knowledge that the Dan room wasn't a place that others were allowed to enter, especially when making Dan. That could easily cause the Dan to fail. But when he saw who the person was, the curses that had reached his mouth instantly shrunk back into his stomach. Danger. It's a catastrophe. He hurriedly stood up and respectfully gave a bow to Shi Fengrong, Master. You are making that Lingdan from last time? Shi Fengrong's head didn't even rise as she unconcernedly crouched by the waist. Yes. Suemo obediently answered, but I haven't succeeded once yet. Shi Fengrong threw away the waist in her hands and stood up, the expression on her face cold. When you don't know how to walk, you want to run. Hearing this, Suemo sweated, and said, Please, Master, give me guidance. In the path of Dan making, the amount of ways to change the recipes involved, there are too many that cannot be passed on through just words. You should first follow the records. Form a good foundation before considering these matters. Finishing, Shi Fengrong left with a cold face. Returning to the little West Wind Yard, Suemo was extremely disheartened. He had thought that he had a method for earning lots of jingshi, but it was really just a mirage, unable to be touched. In the next few days, Suemo was somewhat dispirited. There were no jingshi that could be earned, no contribution points that could be earned, no sword scriptures that could be practiced. With no other choice, Suemo could only practice embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. Sitting above the Ling vein in the rock room, Suemo woke up from meditation. Embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, which had always progressed rapidly, had started to slow down recently. This was the first time that Suemo had encountered something like this after breaking through one breath. Was he going to break through 2 breaths? According to the records in embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, after 1 breath was 2 breaths. If one could achieve 2 breaths, not only would the entire body's points be able to breathe, but at that time, his presence could be restrained. Many people that had higher cultivations wouldn't be able to detect it. This spell was much better than those concealing spells recorded in Elder Wei Nan's jade sticks. Thinking about that, Suemo suddenly remembered that Elder Wei Nan had made Dan and was a Ling plant farmer. Would he have met similar problems? Once the idea was seated, he hurriedly took out the jade sticks and looked carefully. As expected, he quickly made a discovery. In Elder Wei Nan's Dan-making experiences, Suemo found a similar method. But what Elder Wei Nan used wasn't a fire method, but a rarely found water method. There were many methods to make Ling Dan and they all couldn't be counted. The most mainstream one right now was naturally using a cauldron, which was the fire method. The core of the fire method was using the power of the fire to stimulate the Ling energy in the materials. Then the Ling energy of different attributes would be merged together to form a Ling Dan. However, many Ling herbs and grasses were of the Yin attribute, like those Ling grasses grown in water. If fire was used, it would ruin their effects. At this time, it required a different method such as the water method. Other than water and fire, there were still countless other methods of dan making. Water was warm and gentle, far from the fierceness and power of fire. So most water methods required a longer time to form dan. The path it walked was nurturing the dan. Only now did Zuemo know that the cold spring in the rock room had such a purpose. Before, he had completely dismissed the Ling spring. He had wondered why Elder Wei Nan had made a spring in the rock room, since after cultivators reached Chuji, they almost didn't need to consume anything. The jade stick recorded a method that Elder Wei Nan used with Little Art of Cloud and Rain to make moisture dan. Moisture dan was a kind of dan that couldn't enter the grade. Its use was even more frivolous. It could change a person's appearance and skin, but it was only effective for cultivators with Lianqi 3rd level or below. This kind of dan that Zuemo felt had no use at all, after Elder Wei Nan used Little Art of Cloud and Rain to make it, it entered the rank of 1st grade. Its effectiveness had greatly improved. It could improve the features of cultivators that did not go above Zhuji. According to what the jade stick said, this became one of the important ways Elder Wei Nan made wealth. But due to the fact the time used in the water method, Elder Wei Nan only used this method for a period of time before switching to a different method. Different from Zuomo's accident, Elder Wei Nan's investigations were extremely thorough and were recorded very clearly. Elder Wei Nan thought that the reason that those two could combine was due mostly to water. Little Art of Cloud and Rain was the classic water element spell. It was naturally constructive when paired with the water method. There were also large amounts of records on his analysis of the reasons he failed. Zuemo pondered each character as he kept on reading, his thoughts becoming clearer. No wonder he could make great strength pill. Art of Crimson Flame belonged to fire, and the method the fasting pill used was the fire method. Using Art of Crimson Flame to collect the essence of the sun into the fasting pill, that became the great strength pill. There was only one crucial point. Fire. Chapter 51, Attack Fire. The essence of Art of Crimson Flame was fire, and inside the cauldron was the leaf fire seal formation. This was the reason that Zuemo could make great strength pill. However, what Art of Crimson Flame condensed was essence of the sun, and unfortunately the fire that the leaf fire seal formation inside the cauldron provided was too low grade. Originally in the process, the leaf fire seal formation should have been the primary flame, and the essence of the sun that Art of Crimson Fire concentrated should have been the auxiliary. Right now, the sun essence was stronger than the leaf fire seal formation, so naturally problems would occur. He recognized where the problem was. Zuemo instantly had several ideas on how to solve it. The most feasible method was to lessen the sun essence concentrated by Art of Crimson Flame. The least feasible was changing the cauldron to a cauldron with a much higher grade leaf fire seal formation. And the boldest method was to change the relationship between primary and auxiliary, to have Art of Crimson Flame as primary, leaf fire seal formation as auxiliary. Zuemo chose the first option. He felt the possibility of success with the first one the highest. After thinking it through, he started to prepare. What he needed to do first was to be able to precisely control Art of Crimson Flame. Before this, he had never thought about accurately controlling Art of Crimson Flame. For Zuemo, if the sun essence concentrated by Art of Crimson Flame was used on the Ling plants, naturally, the more the better. In reality, it also seemed so. Zuemo had never found a situation where Art of Crimson Flame was overused. Why would he have thought about how to precisely control Art of Crimson Flame? For him, this was a new experience. Thankfully, compared to the other spells, the 5 basic spells of a Ling plant farmer were his most familiar ones. In a short period of time, he grasped the basics of condensing essence of the sun. But when Zuemo once again tried to buy the raw materials of fasting pills from Su Qing, Su Qing's eyes as they stared at him were slightly weird. Buying a large pile of fasting pill ingredients, Suemo secluded himself in the Dan room and started his new experiment. Failure. Still failure. Failure. Suemo wasn't panicked because of his failures, instead he was very steady and calm. He could feel that he was getting closer to success. This feeling was so strong that quite a few times, he had assumed he would succeed next time. The 9th time. Even as the last step was completed, there was no burning smell. Suemo's heartbeat quickened, he swallowed his saliva and nervously opened the cauldron. A fasting pill with glimmers of gold quietly laid at the bottom of the cauldron. There wasn't any cheering or jumping. Suemo's face was expressionless, he stared dumbly as he muttered, "Gu can finally become rich." Finishing, his eyes turned dark and with a bang, he fell onto the floor in a dead sleep. So tiring. In Wukong Hall, Pei Yuanrant's face was ashen as he looked at the two kneeling below. Luo Li and Hao Min were frightened. Seated above, Shi Fengrong's expression was full of anger again. She had always put great importance on the medicinal fields of Cold Mist Valley, which was why she had given them over for Hao Min to care for. She hadn't thought that Hao Min would so seriously neglect her duty. The expression on Yan Lu and Xian Yan's faces weren't much better. Wukong's sword sect might only be a small sect, but their rules had always been strict. It wasn't alarming that the others had left, but both had duties, yet they had sneaked out to travel for such a long time, so they were certainly going to get heavily punished. Suemo woke up and found that he was still in the Dan room. He climbed up and looked at the great strength pill he had made before releasing a breath. So he hadn't been dreaming. He was too lazy to go back to the rock room. He decided to sit in the Dan room and meditate to recover Ling energy. When his Ling energy had recovered, he started to make great strength pill again. He didn't know if it was that he had failed too many times before, but the next attempts, he didn't fail once. Feeling slightly tired, Suemo stood up. After searching for methods for a few days, his body and heart were really very tired and needed rest. Meditation could recover Ling energy but could not substitute for rest. Pushing open the door to leave the Dan room, the sunlight stabbed Suemo's eyes. He raised a hand to cover them. However, the feeling of the sun landing on his body was really good. Successfully making a Dan, Suemo's mood was very good. Suddenly, he saw the person walking towards him and blanked. Wasn't that Hao Min Shiji? She and Luo Li Shixiang had returned. Thoughts swirled in Suemo's brain and he decided to give a greeting, Hao Min Shi. Only when he walked closer did he find it was not good. Hao Min's eyes were red, clearly having cried. Just having been scolded, Hao Min saw Suemo and suddenly remembered that Cold Mist Valley had been given to this zombie face to care for. When she suddenly thought of the scolding and sternness of the sect leader and master, her anger rose. It had to be this guy who did it. Otherwise, how would Master have known about Cold Mist Valley? Once the idea emerged, she felt that this zombie face was hateful and resentment rose. An outer sect disciples dared to trick this lady? Her brow raised, without a word, she raised her hand, heading for Suemo's face. Suemo, who had remained alert, reacted very quickly and grabbed Hao Min's wrist, asking in a deep voice, "Shiji, what are you doing?" The anger in Suemo's heart rose up as well. Before, he wouldn't have any choice when he encountered something like this, but now, the two of them were on equal ground. He wouldn't act first, but he didn't have to swallow and bear it. "You dare!" Hao Min ground her teeth, extremely enraged, "Even a trash like you dare to offend me." Before her words landed, her free left hand headed for Suemo's face, not giving Suemo the chance to speak. Suemo's pupils suddenly shrank, his eyes becoming frigid. The right hand that had practiced countless finger movements was extremely fast and nimble. Before Hao Min's hand could reach Suemo's face, she suddenly felt her eyes blur and a slap landed on her face. Hao Min blanked after the slap. Her face was burning in pain. She looked in disbelief at Suemo Su Qing, who had coincidentally just left the yard, saw this scene and almost screamed out in shock. Her reaction was very quick as she used her hands to cover her mouth. Xuemo looked coldly at Hao Min, his voice frigid. Has Shiji woken up? Giving a penetrating look at Hao Min, he released Hao Min's wrist and took a step back. For some reason, when Hao Min met Xuemo's gaze, it was like she was completely frozen, her body cold. She shuddered all over, her face going green and red. Terror, embarrassment, anger, it was all mixed together. She actually forgot to speak. Oh, right. Shiji just returned and might not know the latest news. Xuemo, who had turned around, stopped and said coldly, "This little brother was lucky and was taken into the inner sect, and I am now under master to learn danmaking." He turned around his zombie face, showing off 2 rows of eerie white teeth. "Shiji, please take care of me." Su Qing stared with wide eyes as Xuemo left. The blow the scene gave her was too big. Before Xuemo, Hao Ming was the only inner sect disciples in Fragrant Ginger Yard. She had been arrogant and despotic to the extreme. Everyone had feared her. For some reason, when Su Qing saw the 5-fingered handprint on Hao Min's face, she felt unspeakably exhilarated. Glancing at Hao Min, who was still dazedly standing in her original spot, Su Qing decided to quietly leave. If Hao Min Shiji knew that she had seen this incident, then she would be in a miserable situation. Retreating, Su Qing still felt some disbelief. Awe for Xuemo formed. Zhuo Shixiang, who had been so agreeable, usually actually had a time when he was this scary. Xuemo walked out of Fragrant Ginger Yard, his hand imperceptibly trembling. His heart was full of terror. It wasn't terror due to Hao Min but terror of himself. Just then, in his anger, there seemed to have been a voice saying to him, "Kill her. Kill her." That impulse was so strong and clear, so strong that what he had given wasn't a slap but sword energy. At what time had he become so ruthless? This discovery made him very nervous. In the stories, all the Yaoma were terrible and evil, villains who killed like it was their life. Was the cause practicing, embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, causing his personality had been secretly influenced? Or was it Pu Yao that was behind it? He stopped, closed his eyes and took a deep breath before exhaling. All the negative emotions seemed to have been vented out in this breath. When he opened his eyes, his gaze resumed its clarity, his hands resumed steadiness. It was probably that he was too tired this little while. Xuemo hadn't practiced embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation for a short period of time. This had never happened before. As to Pu Yao, the guy was a perverse one, but he was definitely a cautious perverse. He would never actively stir up trouble. Xuemo found that Pu Yao was still extremely wary of his elders, especially Xin Yen Shishu. Returning to Little West Wind Yard, Xuemo decided to not think at all and rest for a time. He put himself on the guard, reminding himself to be careful and attentive. For a whole day, he did nothing except sleep. He was woken up by the pink paper crane. Yi heard that there were stars appearing during the day. Was it fun? It was still the graceful writing that Xuemo was familiar with. Never heard of it. Xuemo answered confidently. Stars appearing during the day, how was it possible? In any case, he was certain that he had never seen such an abnormal thing. Ah, but the news I heard was really like that. Yi has to be careful. Stars appearing during the day is an ill omen. It's possibly Yaoma. Xuemo's heart jumped. Yaoma. Such a familiar smell. Pu Yao had crept up beside Xuemo. He stared at the pink paper in Xuemo's hands and then smiled, so it's that little girl. Xuemo felt that Pu Yao's smile was very cold. You recognize her? He asked carefully. Recognize? Pu Yao's bloody right eye narrowed into a line as he smiled happily. Of course I recognize her. His gaze landed on the paper in Xuemo's hands and snickered, Yaoma. This little girl is interesting, I like her. Leaving behind a stream of meaningful laughter, Pu Yao disappeared, leaving behind Zhuemo with a head full of confusion. Zhuemo really didn't have good feelings towards the owner of this paper crane. Anything, once it was forced, the feeling would be very bad. Chatting was also the same. However, it really had been him that brought it upon himself. Zhuemo could do nothing about it. His own actions, he had to take responsibility. In the following days, after Zhuemo felt he had rested enough, he returned back to his glorious mission of earning Jingxi. In one go, he made 20 great strength pills, and gave them all to Li Yingfeng. Li Yingfeng also gave the Jinji jade stick that she had mentioned last time to him and reminded him that his conflict with Hao Min had spread through the entire sect and he should be careful. When Zhuemo heard this, he knew it was going to be bad. But he quickly composed himself after some thought. This kind of thing, dodging it wasn't effective. But when he returned to the mouth of West Wing Valley, he saw the ruins of the Jinji and the arrogantly standing Luo Li Shixiao. Zhuemo stopped in his steps. Chapter 52 All In. I hadn't thought that even you could become an inner sect disciple. Luo Li's face was expressionless, his voice cold. Zhuemo looked inside the valley and he was slightly relieved. Luo Li had only tore down the Jinji at the mouth but didn't go in. He clearly came prepared. Luo Li might be doted upon by all the elders but he didn't dare to act too brashly. If the ling grasses and herbs inside the valley were damaged, the elders in the sect wouldn't let him off. Machinations in the shadows, Zhuemo was clear the other didn't dare use them on him. The kind of identity that a ling plant farmer had, it meant that he would receive the sect's protection. What the other could use was an open and public attack. Looking at the mess and the completely ruined Jinji, even though Zhuemo knew the other was just venting, but his anger still rose. The other had definitely come because of Hao Min Shiji. Zhuemo wasn't scared. He had reason on his side. Even if it got brought up to the sect leader, no one would say that he was wrong. Zhuemo controlled the anger, his voice mocking, Shixiang's sword is so sharp. A pity to waste these flowers and grasses. Luo Li looked coldly at Zhuemo, his eyes filled with disdain and contempt. Whether my sword is sharp or not, you will know. You dare to touch my woman. Oh. Zhuemo brushed it off. He looked at his right hand and said unconcernedly, so what if I touched her? If there hadn't been the previous incident with Hao Min, these two were people that he would have tried to curry favor with. But since it had proceeded to this step, both sides like water and fire, there was no possibility of peace. Zhuemo's stubbornness came out. Rather than be bullied, he would rather rebel. Even if it might end terribly for him, he wouldn't let the other off easily. If he didn't have some viciousness, with his origins as an outer sect disciple, he would be greatly bullied in the future. Luo Li's pupils shrunk, the indifferent expression on his face finally changing. 3 months, the assessment of the sect, I'll wait for you. You said wait, so you'll wait? Zhuemo smiled coldly, and gasped, Shixiang's face is so big. Luo Li's expression twisted. His eyes sprouted fire as he looked at Zhuemo. He barely managed to control himself and snorted angrily, let's see if your mouth is still that hard then. Finishing, he flew off. Who does he think he is? Zhuemo snorted coldly. He turned to walk inside the valley. Everything in the valley was undisturbed. Luo Li basically didn't come in. Luo Li might be arrogant but he wasn't dumb. He controlled his behavior. Ruining the Jinji of West Wind Valley but not touching the ling grasses in the valley, the elders of the sect would let it go. They forbid fighting in the sect. Every sect would have this kind of rules. But fighting inside the sect would always happen. There were many reasons but one of the most important ones was undoubtedly the implicit permission of the elders in the sect. What a sect was afraid of was not having a competitive environment. The occasional skirmish was more beneficial than harmful in the eyes of elders. In most cases, they held a permissive attitude. But Suemo felt that these things didn't have too much to do with him. He didn't believe that Luoli would dare come into West Wind Valley. His West Wind Valley was one of the important areas of the sect, possibly even more important than Cold Mist Valley. Just like normal, he continued to make Dan, right up until Li Yingfeng Shiji came. What? Suemo cried out, what kind of rule is that? Li Yingfeng explained, it's really like this. Supposedly, because the sect forbid the disciples from fighting, so they made the sect assessment the place for resolving conflicts. He can challenge you at that time and you must take it up. If you don't, you have to give the other 50 contribution points. But I am a Ling plant farmer. A Ling plant farmer, do you want me to grab a flying sword and start fighting with him? Suemo was indignant. You can ask someone. Li Yingfeng was also helpless, that doesn't break the rules. Production cultivators like you can use the Dan you make or what you've planted to hire others. But you can only ask the other Shixiang in the sect, not anyone from other sections. The other Shixiang in the sect? Wei Xing Shixiang hasn't come out, who else can I invite? Suemo felt that he was going crazy. The only person in the sect that could win over Luoli was Wei Xing Shixiang. But Wei Xing Shixiang was in the Sword Cave and won't be coming out soon. The rules are like this. Li Yingfeng suggested, you could go by some powerful talismans. Suemo felt that he was going to faint. By talismans? He was so poor he only had the dregs. Buying talismans. Only now did Suemo understand what Luoli had meant in his last word that day. His mood instantly became terrible. Damn it. It was going to be big trouble. Facing Luoli outside the valley, he wasn't afraid because he had been confident that Luoli didn't dare to do anything to him. When he knew that the inner sect had this rule, he instantly blanked. Things like sword energy, it was fine to use to frighten people. Facing Luoli who practiced empty sword, someone who didn't even have a sword scripture, wouldn't even know how he died. The elders in the sect, of course, wouldn't let Luoli really injure him, but humiliation wouldn't be avoided. 50 contribution points, that was a very large amount of wealth. If he sold himself, he wouldn't get 50 contribution points. Thinking about it, Suemo became even more depressed. Li Yingfeng looked in sympathy at Suemo. She wanted to help but had no way. She could only take the great strength pills that Suemo had prepared and left. The news that Luoli had sent out a challenge to Suemo was instantly spread to everyone in the sect. These days when Hao Min saw Suemo, she instantly became high and mighty. Suemo wanted to slap her again. The gazes of everyone else when they saw Suemo was extremely strange. Of course, there wasn't a lack of others who were laughing at Suemo. No one thought that Suemo was going to have a good outcome. I heard that your Luoli Shixiang sent a challenge to you. Shifeng Rong calmly asked Suemo. Even Master knew. Suemo could only reply, yes. N. The matter between you and your Haomin Shiji, I won't interfere. Shifeng Rong said coldly, but the assessment in the sect, I don't care what method you use, but you will not lose. If you lose, the implication in the last sound made Suemo's already withered heart dry up like a flower petal and scatter to the ground. This disciple is only a Ling plant farmer, Suemo couldn't help reminding Master. So what if you are a Ling plant farmer? Shifeng Rong's voice went up, her eyes resolute, my disciple cannot lose. But, I don't care what method you use. Shifeng Rong impatiently interrupted Suemo's heart turned and he said, Master is so confident in this disciple naturally doesn't want to fail. This disciple has nothing to request except to pick a sword scripture from the records room. Since Master wanted him not to lose, then it would be dumb if he didn't ask for a bit of help. He thought of the Li Water sword scripture, in the records room. It's too late for you to start practicing the sword now. Shifeng Rong furrowed her brow. This disciple only has this one request. Suemo saw that it might be possible and his heart lightened as he hurried responded. If that's the case, I can agree. She looked at Suemo and her voice was stern as she said, but if you lose, I won't let you off lightly. Yes. Suemo resolutely promised. Take this tile. You can pick a sword scripture from the records room. Shi Fengrong's expression was icy as she stated. 3 months. Right now, Suemo was only grateful the sect assessment was 3 months in the future. He still had a hint of life. With the quickest possible speed, he picked Lee Water Sword Scripture, and ran for the Little West Wind Yard. He was clear what Luo Li was planning on. The whole sect, everyone felt that he didn't have a chance of winning, but Suemo didn't want to admit defeat like this. Whenever he thought of Luo Li and Hao Min's faces, the anger in his chest rose. And this would directly decide his future status in the sect. To say of nothing else, Master's warning was in his ears. Wasn't it just a sword scripture? What was simpler than sword scripture? After getting sliced a few thousand times, would he get it? Suemo thought hatefully. There was no possibility of winning if he relied on normal methods. His gamble was all on Puyao. But gambling on Puyao meant countless jingshi. You want help? Alright, as long as you can pay the jingshi. Anything can be discussed. Puyao said interestedly, if the price you pay is high enough, oh, I can go sort Luo Li out immediately. Guarantee no one would find out. As expected. As Suemo expected, Puyao started his extortion. What? It's higher than the previous price? Of course, this is called reacting to the market. The smile on Puyao's face was enchanting, you have to consider it well. The price tomorrow would be even higher. Suemo went to find Li Yingfeng. Shiji, how much jingshi can you lend me? Suemo's eyes were red, his throat rough. Li Yingfeng didn't hesitate, I can lend it all, 3/3 grade. Many thanks, Shiji. Suemo didn't waste words. There was only gratefulness in his heart. It was only at the crucial time that it could be seen if a person was worthy. Old Black and Guolu also unhesitatingly gave all the jingshi they had to Suemo. Even Su Qing secretly gave Suemo 50 pieces of second-grade jingshi. The whole sect knew that Suemo was borrowing jingshi. Many people were looking at it as a joke. Did he ask you yet? Ha, I don't dare to lend to him. Exactly. Just became an inner sect disciple and dare to offend Hao Min Shiji, he really thinks he's someone. Oh, I remember that Xiaomo was a pretty steady person, why would he do something so dumb? When a little person enjoys success, they become arrogant. Suemo sold all of the mature ling herbs and grasses in his ling fields and received 1 piece of 3rd-grade jingshi. Roughly calculating, Suemo had about 6 pieces of 3rd-grade jingshi on his hands. This was a huge sum, a sum that Suemo had never even thought about. Not long ago, his yearly income was 20 or so second-grade jingshi. The 6 pieces of 3rd-grade jingshi gave off an enticing shine and a strong ling energy vibration. This is everything I gathered, give it all to you. Suemo threw the 6 pieces of 3rd-grade jingshi to Puyao. Puyao grinned as he took the jingshi. He played with one with his right hand, gently throwing it up and then gently catching it. His expression was intoxicated as he said, such a moving sound, jingshi is really the most reliable thing in this world. Teach me this. Suemo took out the jade stick for Lee Water Sword Scripture, his voice resolute. His expression was slightly tired, the zombie face slightly gray, but the pair of eyes were like 2 balls of jumping flames, hot and vicious. All in. Chapter 53 Great Strength Pill Dong Fu. Master Yen, if there is snow foxtail grass next time, don't forget to notify me. An old person dressed grandly kept on adding. Yen Li's round face was full of smiles, of course, of course. Master Wang, don't worry. I'll certainly leave it for you. That's good. Master Wang nodded in satisfaction and then said enviously, your sect really has many great talents. You even have a ling plant farmer now. In the future, you'll have more support. Yen Lo was smug inside but didn't show it. He repeatedly shook his hands. Master Wang exaggerates, our sect still needs your guidance. The two exchanged a few more courtesies before Yen Lo saw Master Wang out the door. Ling plant farmers are really ling plant farmers. Returning to the store, Yen Lo sighed in satisfaction. He was extremely grateful that he had coincidentally encountered Sui Mo that day. Otherwise, he might have been snatched away by another sect. If this kept on going, then the sect will have an additional source of wealth. More importantly, the sect's influence in Dong Fu will increase dramatically. In the future, Wukong Sword Sect would have an astonishing genius like Wei Sheng, a ling plant farmer like Sui Mo and someone skilled at business like Li Yingfeng. The sect would pass on very well into their hands. Li Yingfeng took in everything. Taking advantage of Master's good mood, she opened her mouth to help Sui Mo. Yes, Master, look, our business is much better than before. Sui Mo Shixiang was a large part. Yen Lo was clever and understood what his disciple was saying. He chuckled, you don't have to say things for yours with Shixiang. I know you two have a good relationship. He said unconcernedly, young people, dampening the spirit, it isn't a bad thing. Yours was Shixiang looks easy to speak to, but in his bones, he is a very stubborn person. And he had to end up with an extremely competitive master. Huh, it's so funny. Yen Lo thought of something and roared with laughter. Li Yingfeng said furiously, but Shixiang is a ling plant farmer. The sect assessment only tests the sword, why not, little art of cloud and rain? Isn't this to bully people? Huh, disciple, don't be angry. Our sect is a sword sect. If we don't test the sword, what do we test? Don't worry, we're going to be there. Naturally, we wouldn't let him be humiliated too much. But if he isn't as good as others, it's hard to avoid suffering a bit. Yen Li's expression became stern, us sword cultivators, what we pursue is our hearts like a sword. What is a sword? That is win or lose, that's life or death, that's death if one does not advance. You have to remember, what sword cultivators walk is going against the heavens. He is a ling plant farmer but since he is in a sword sect, he needs to understand this. Li Yingfeng was entranced by the words and became speechless, standing still at her spot. Seeing this, Yen Lo smiled and didn't disturb her, heading inside the hall. Suddenly, someone pushed open the door to enter. The great strength pill I wanted, is there any? The person asked straightaway. Li Yingfeng instantly shook and her thoughts returned. She hurriedly responded, yes, yes. The other gave a joyful expression, asking, how many? 20. Great. I'll take all of them. The other instantly said. Li Yingfeng reacted very quickly. She cleverly shook her head, I can only sell 15 to you. The other asked dissatisfied, why can't you sell all of it to me? Li Yingfeng's expression was calm as she lied, someone reserved 5. All right. The other was helpless. He had only ordered 10 in the beginning, then sell 15 to me. He crisply paid the jinxure, took the great strength pill and rushed away. Li Yingfeng looked at the remaining 5 great strength pills, her mind turning furiously. This person had put so much importance on this great strength pill, this great strength pill definitely had something that wasn't normal. If she could find what was unique, then the way to sell this great strength pill would open. Otherwise, she could only sell to this one person. She decided to send the great strength pill to the medical institute to have an expert examination. Even though it needed a significant payment, she could finally figure out the use of this great strength pill that Shitty had made. Wu Ming held the great strength pill he had just brought, his heart joyful. He didn't know who made the name, but it really wasn't pleasing. Such a good Dan, but such a country bumpkin name. It really ruined the Dan. He was smug inside. It was lucky that he was sensitive to fire-oriented Ling energy. Otherwise last time, he would have brushed right past this Dan. Last time, he had accidentally found that this Dan that was being sold had a faint flavor of fire. He had been born sensitive to the fire element. The fire element in this Dan might be faint, but it was extremely pure, so he had unhesitatingly brought it. After using it, to his joy and surprise, he found that fire energy in the Dan was actually sun essence. Fire, one of the 5 elements. In Sky Moon Jia, those that cultivated fire far surpassed the number of those that cultivated the 4 other elements added together. No matter if it was forging, or Dan making, or food refining, it couldn't leave fire. The most common scene was Li fire. It was also the most normal kind of fire. And what was chased after were all kinds of strange fire sources. Producing using high-grade fire sources meant that the process was half done and what was created was even more pure. Originating from the sun, Golden Crow fire, it was a fire source of 4th grade. Of course, Golden Crow fire came from the sun, but how to assimilate it, how to nurture it, only a rare few of the biggest sects knew of the method. And it was always passed on secretly. Even more, the 4th grade Golden Crow fire was fiery and hard to control. It was easy to harm the body. So the people that could use Golden Crow fire were very rare. So that was why Wu Ming was so happy when he found that strand of essence of the sun in this great strength pill. What made him even more exhilarated was that this essence of the sun was extremely young, but warm and harmless. Nurturing it inside the body, he actually didn't feel any ill effects. Like a treasure, he grew this strand of sun essence in his body. Even though it was an extremely thin strand and very far from becoming Golden Crow fire, but if he could buy more great strength pills, and as the sun essence accumulated, there would be hope of the Golden Crow fire. Even if it would not form Golden Crow fire, this extremely pure and young sun essence could increase the grade of other fire sources if it was merged. Golden Crow fire wasn't something that could be bought with Jingxia. His mood was very good after buying 15 great strength pills. After absorbing all 15, the sun essence in his body would dramatically increase. It was still very far from forming Golden Crow energy, but it was a start. Right now, he was hoping that no one else had found the benefit of this great strength pill. However, he knew his thoughts were slightly unrealistic. Other people weren't dumb. Great strength pill should be a new kind of Dan that just came out. As a result, he got a bargain. But he guessed that other people would quickly ascertain its effects. If he wanted to buy it in the future, it wouldn't be at this price. That strand of sun essence, it was worth far more than its present price. But he was already walking in front of everyone else. Adding on that his financial situation was well off, he wasn't afraid. Suemo felt his sea of consciousness was slightly unfamiliar. He hadn't come for a certain period of time and the changes inside were pretty big. The area of the consciousness of much larger than before. The alluring deep red fire was like a furiously growing weed, now a section taller. The star in the void seemed even further away, but it was even more brighter. The temperature of the ice river was even lower, the icicles inside were even finer, the movement of the tides more powerful than before. Well, at least you weren't dumb to the end and picked a sword scripture suited to you. Pu Yao said lazily. Suemo listened extremely attentively. Honestly speaking, your talents at cultivating the sword really aren't anything. If it was your Shixiang, if he had been sliced 10 times by sword essence, he probably would have comprehended it. 20 times, he could reach where you are now. You were sliced thousands of times to reach this progress, he. Pu Yao wasn't courteous. Suemo wasn't moved. However, your talents with the 5 elements are not bad. Pu Yao's voice suddenly became distant and deep. In this word, there is only appropriate or not, never the strongest. This, Li Water sword scripture, can't be considered anything good but it is appropriate for you. Pu Yao gave a rare compliment. Suemo opened his ears, fearful of losing a word. Every word that Pu Yao said was automatically converted by him into Jingshi. Li, in the 8 trigrams, it belongs to fire, creating the saying Li fire. Anything in the world is sorted into yin and yang. Yang as fire, yin as water. Li water, the person who made this sword scripture is an interesting one. It was probably because he had received enough Jingshi that Pu Yao showed patience he never had before. This sword scripture, it still goes along the road of water. However, manipulate water as fire. Pu Yao evaluated, the idea isn't bad but it's pretty unprofessional. No wonder it's only 3rd grade. Then Pu Yao raised his head and glanced at Suemo, adding, but for you to learn, it's more than enough. Very quickly, Suemo felt that the 6 pieces of 3rd grade Jingshi were worth it. This profound and cryptic sword scripture, under Pu Yao's explanations, became clear and easy to understand. 2 hours later, Pu Yao started his conclusions. All right, this is about it. All that's needed to be said has been said. If you still can't learn it, then it's you who's too dumb. This is the end. Suemo, who was entranced, asked unconsciously. Finished. Didn't you say that it had many flaws? Suemo persistently asked. Pu Yao gave his enchanting smile. The service of changing the sword scripture, you need to pay otherwise. Looking on the fact that we are familiar, I'll give you a discount. Only 100 pieces of 3rd grade Jingshi. I'll change it to 4th grade. 5th grade, 1,000 pieces of 3rd grade Jingshi. 100 pieces of 3rd grade Jingshi. Suemo unhesitatingly turned and left the sea of consciousness. Behind him, Pu Yao laughed cheerfully. Leaving the sea of consciousness, Suemo found an empty space in the mountain valley. He took care to pick a place far from the Ling fields. Pu Yao had clearly stated the rationale. In conclusion, it was one sentence: manipulate water like fire. Basically, it was using the methods for manipulating fire to control water. Suemo increasingly found that this sword scripture was suited for him. His only flying sword was the 3rd grade ice crystal sword. Ice, the basic attribute, was water. The sword essence he comprehended, it was the tidal sword essence of Xian Yen Shishu, that was also related to water. And the core of this, Li water sword scripture, was also water. Was it even the heavens found Luo Li and Isor? Suemo snickered darkly. He quickly took himself out of his thoughts. No matter how much of the rationale he understood, sword scriptures had to be practiced. How to manipulate water like fire, he didn't know. 3 months. He only had a time of 3 months. The vision of Hao Min's arrogant attitude and Luo Li's disdainful gaze floated up in his head. Suemo unconsciousness tightened his fist. If he couldn't overcome this step, how could he pursue the answers? Chapter 54 Fire, 1 grade Lingdan, contains a small amount of essence of the sun, affects warm, suited for long-term consumption, a certain possibility of forming golden crow fire. Those who consume it can become excited in the short term and can be used for emergencies. When Li Yingfeng received this appraisal, she was shocked. There wasn't much about the other effects, but she was shocked still by a certain possibility of forming golden crow fire. After the appraisal, there was also an order form. The Medicine Institute was hoping to buy 100 pills, price able to be discussed. The Medicine Institute also suggested changing the same to Golden Crow Pill. Clearly, everyone hated the bumpkin name that was Great Strength Pill. Immediately, Li Yingfeng gave the appraisal to her master. Seeing the 3 words, Golden Crow Fire, Yen Lu was shocked still. He took the appraisal, throwing down a, "I'm going out," before flying into the sky, heading straight for Wukong Mountain. In Wukong Hall, all 4 elders of the Wukong sword sect were present. Pei Yan Ran looked at the appraisal on his hand and had a serious expression. He said in a deep voice, "Golden Crow Fire, this is a 4th grade fire seed." Xin Yen nodded, "Exactly, my green mulberry fire, Shimmy's violet flora fire, they are all 4th grade. I had heard of this golden crow fire before, it comes from the sun, extremely young, extremely strong. It cannot be merged. In the 4th grade, it is a rare fine fire source." Pei Yuan Ran smiled at Shifeng Rong, "Shimmy is really great. Zuemo had just studied with you and could make such a good thing as this." Shifeng Rong had a cold face, "This has nothing to do with me." Pei Yuan Ran smiled, not minding. He lowered his head to think. The other people were also silent. Golden Crow Fire, 4th grade fire source. This caused this little Dan's price to fly into the sky. Shi Xiang. Yen Lu couldn't resist stating, if it can form Golden Crow Fire, then its use for the sect would be gigantic. Doesn't Su Yi still lack a good fire seed? And Zuemo himself, if he's learning Dan making, how can he not have a fire seed? What he was implying was that he wasn't very willing to sell it. Pei Yuan Ran raised his head, responding, "I understand what you mean. That child, Su Yi, I like him as well. And the forging branch of this sect would likely be passed on through him. He really does need Golden Crow Fire. But we still have to sell some. Right now, the outside probably has heard the news about this Dan. If we don't sell any, it would enrage the public. That would only harm the sect without any benefit." Then Shi Xiang means, Yen Lu was hesitant. "Just sell a small portion, we'll use the majority ourselves." Pei Yuan Ran gave a slight smile, "We'll give the market price to Zuemo, not 1 piece less." Market price? Yes. Paper cannot hide fire. There are only just that many people in our Wukong sword sect that can make Dan. There's no need to cause Zuemo to hate us in secret because of a few pieces of Jingshi. Zuemo's past is unclear. There may be trouble in the future. Shifeng Rong, who had kept her cold face, suddenly opened. Wukong Hall became silent. Zuemo's identity and origins was a question that everyone had been having a headache about. Before, Zuemo had only been an outer sect disciple. His origin hadn't been a big problem. But right now, he wasn't just an inner sect disciple. Based on the direction, he would certainly become one of the core members of the next generation of Wukong sword sect. His identity and origins became a problem that Pei Yuan Ran and the others had to face. His origins might not be a problem, Yen Lu said unconfidently. Pei Yuan Ran waved his hand, "Since we don't know anything, then don't think too much about it. Regardless, just the fact that he is a Ling plant farmer, that's enough that we cannot give him up. Even more, there's now this Ling Dan that could make Golden Crow Fire." Hearing this, everyone didn't speak anymore. They all knew that sect leader Shi Xiang was right. If they suddenly expelled Zuemo right now out of the sect, it would be what countless people wanted. Xin Yen suddenly asked, "Can Shimmy make this kind of Dan?" "I don't know, Art of Crimson Flame." Shifeng Rong said coolly, "This Dan needs to use, Art of Crimson Flame. Manipulate water like fire." It was easy to say, but for a Ling plant farmer, it was very difficult, especially when it was in a sword scripture. There were, in total, 7 moves in Li Water Sword Scripture. Manipulate water like fire was the core, but it was too far right now for Zuemo. What he needed to do was familiarize himself with the sword moves. Each move would always have a few dozens of transformations. And each transformation needed to be controlled by Ling energy. Even more, the entire process had to be completed in a thought. Based on the complexity of Ling energy manipulation, these sword moves weren't as complex as Little Art of Cloud and Rain, but they needed to be finished in a very short amount of time, so the difficulty actually increased. When making the move, the attention needed to be focused. That was even truer during battle. The other usually wouldn't give you the chance to think. You needed to instinctively finish the complete move. This was also why sword cultivators liked pure things. The purer something was, the less the disturbance it had. Mo finally could use that ice crystal sword. It was certainly a painful thing to look at a good item yet be unable to use it. The ice crystal sword turned into a flashing white light as it flew around Mo, coldness seeping out. It was silent, yet it gave the feeling of being able to explode. Li Water Sword Scripture wasn't a sword scripture that used sword moves to win. It only had 7 sword moves and they were relatively simple. As he practiced, Mo increasingly felt that the person who created this sword scripture probably was a Ling plant farmer. Many of the ways that the Ling energy moved in the scripture was similar to the 5-element spells of a Ling plant farmer. Receiving the benefit of that, Mo quickly familiarized himself with the sword moves. But familiarity was familiarity, so when he moved, there was still a feeling of rawness. Even Mo could see that his sword moves only had the appearance but not the substance of the move. But he had no solution for that. He might have comprehended a bit of sword essence but he didn't know at all how to merge sword essence with sword moves. Right now, he was just swallowing it all and hoping to digest some. The manipulation of water like fire that Pu Yao had said, Mo couldn't make heads or tails of it. According to Pu Yao, the power of this Li Water Sword Scripture wasn't strong originally. If he couldn't manipulate water like fire, this sword scripture didn't have any value. Manipulate water like fire. Damn it, how could he manipulate water like fire? His fundamentals were really too weak despite that he had touched the door to sword essence. Wei Sheng was obsessed with the sword, the number of sword scriptures and research that he had encountered couldn't be counted. Even though it wasn't anything high quality, but he had already killed and with his wealthy battle experience, his fundamentals were extremely deep and no average sect disciple could compare. And inner sect disciples like Luo Li, they were taught from little by their master, they could read everything in the records. In comparison, their fundamentals were much thicker than Mo. He barely managed to get a master, but she only taught him danmaking. When he had been Lianqi, he had only roughly studied those basic sword scriptures that Wei Sheng had given him. He truly had a weak base. Pu Yao had lectured for 2 hours but it was all theoretical guidance, none of it practical. But the time Mo had was only 3 months, how could he not be panicked? Inside, he cursed the adulterous couple of Luo Li and Hao Min countless times. Mo tried to remain calm. He had practiced, little art of cloud and rain, to the 4th level, but had never found anything that connected it to fire. Don't panic, don't panic. Closing his eyes, Mo recited to himself over and over. When he opened his eyes again, his gaze had recovered its clarity, but deeply hidden was a touch of stubbornness. Pu Yao said, wasn't it just sword essence? Sliced a few thousand times, naturally you will learn. Mo said to himself, wasn't it just a sword scripture? Gu will slice it 10,000 times, if it fails, then a few dozen more, don't believe it won't work. If it doesn't, then slice 1,000,000 times. Slice until it works. Having decided, Mo wasn't panicked anymore and raised up his sword. I slice. Little West Wind Yard, the sword energy flew, coldness spread. A storefront on the west street of Dongfu, many people had already gathered. These people gathered together and chattered and argued. Why hasn't it opened yet? I've already waited an entire night. Someone grouched. What's a night? I've been guarding for 2 days and nights. A person on the side followed up. Is this store going to open? Are they playing with us? What can we do? It's their Dan, if they want to sell, they sell, if they don't, you don't have a choice. That's true. Do you really think that Golden Crow pill can really form Golden Crow fire? Someone couldn't resist asking, 4th grade Golden Crow fire, does anyone in Dongfu have it? Haven't heard that anyone had it. But it was an appraisal from the Medicine Institute so it shouldn't be far off. Nothing else, essence of the sun, it would be beneficial if it's added to a fire source. The person who spoke was brawny and tall with a square face and large ears. He sighed, the kind of thing that is fire seed, especially good fire source, is it something people like us can buy? Bro, what do you do? Me? The square-faced man said, I make food. At this time, an old man suddenly greeted him, Hey, Master Xiao, you came too. The crowd suddenly stirred. The person who had been speaking with the square-faced man instantly had a very interesting expression. No one would have thought that this large and brawny man was actually the best Ling food chef in Dongfu. The food pavilion of Master Xiao, it was the most famous Ling food restaurant in Dongfu. He was especially skilled at making marvelous combinations of all kinds of Ling food. The Ling food he made, it didn't only increased cultivation but the flavor was incomparable. Just Ling grains, he could make over 36 dishes. The square-faced man raised his hands, Shopkeeper Wang, are you also here for the Golden Crow pill? The crowd stirred again. Some people had already guessed the old man's origins. Master Xiao's food pavilion, Wang So Wine. The food pavilion sold all kinds of Ling food, and old man Wang was skilled at fermenting all kinds of Ling wine. Exactly. The person was a thin old man, his spine slightly bent but his beady eyes were extremely bright. His expression was slightly helpless, I'm here for my precious granddaughter. Master Xiao chucked, what's the little girl learning? Forging. Old man Wang was clearly unsatisfied with his granddaughter choosing to learn forging. He couldn't help complaining, my son learnt dan making, my granddaughter learns forging. My handicraft, it seems I'm taking it into the ground. Don't panic, don't panic. If you ask for disciples, there would be countless people trying to get in. Master Xiao hurriedly comforted. Oh. Evidently having thought of something, old man Wang sighed. He looked at the surroundings. Seeing that more and more people were coming, his brow furrowed, this Wukong sword sect looks like it's going to rise. And Master Xiao agreed, but they do have the ability. Yes. At this time, the tightly closed store door suddenly opened. Chapter 55, Going to Get Rich? Li Yingfeng was slightly drowsy as she opened the store door. After Master had rushed back to Wukong Mountain a few days ago, he still hadn't returned. These 2 days, because Master wasn't here, she had kept the store closed. In any case, the recent inventory had pretty much all been sold. The next batch of Ling Dan from 4th Shirgu still hadn't left the cauldron and there wasn't much else to sell in the store. Wukong sword sect was only a small sect and didn't have much produce. In Dongfu, they only had this small store. Most of what they sold were the Ling Dan that 4th Shirgu made and the talismans that 2nd Shirshu forged. If nothing was happening, she would sleep. After entering Zhuji, there wasn't much need for sleep. However, for women sleep wasn't just a requirement, it was a form of relaxation. On this point, Li Yingfeng wasn't an exception. She frequently slept until her eyes rolled and became muddle-headed. It was completely different from her usual cleverness and generosity. Muddle-headed, Li Yingfeng seemed to see that there were many people outside the door. She suddenly became alert, her drowsiness completely vanished. Looking at the dense field of people, her entire body became numb. So many people, what had happened? It's open. Finally open. Hey, boss, I want to buy. Pushing open the store door was like the spark that lit the fire. The originally quiet situation suddenly became noisy and messy. Looking at the sea of heads outside, Li Yingfeng was like a statue, pinned to the door entrance. In the West Wind Valley, Zhua Mo felt that his entire body was numb, not one place wasn't sore. Barely controlling the Ling energy in his body, the ice crystal sword was wobbling in mid-air. His eyes glared furiously as he tried to control the last remaining bit of Ling energy in his body. Go! The voice was rough and dissonant. The wobbling ice crystal sword turned to a flash of white light, leaving behind a faint cold mist in the air. Pa! The white light hit the wooden target 10 feet away. There was a figure drawn on the target. It was the person whose Wuemo cursed countless times every day, Luoli. The wooden target instantly shattered. Each fragment was coated with a thin layer of ice. Fighting with GE. Kill you. Opening his eyes, Wuemo couldn't resist groaning. So painful. As he was struggling up, when he saw where he was, he finally remembered that he had fainted when practicing Li Water Sword Scripture, as his Ling energy ran out. First seeing that he was covered in mud. Then thinking about how in his dream, he had demolished the wooden target that had Luoli drawn on it, he couldn't help laughing. That was really absurd. 1006. That was the number of attacks he remembered before fainting. The Ling energy in his body was at a dangerously low level. Before fainting, he had used up the Ling energy too much. He decided to go to the rock room to recover his Ling energy. The soreness over his body meant that each step was extremely painful. Like a turtle, he moved slowly towards the opening, his mouth giving groans along the way. Shitty, shitty. Wuemo suddenly heard someone yelling from outside the valley. It was somewhat familiar. He stopped walking. He was secretly grateful that he hadn't entered the stone room. He saw Su-Yi Shixiang fly in. When he saw Wuemo's sorry state, he first blanked and then smiled. How did Shitty get like this? Wuemo grimaced, I wasn't careful when practicing the sword and tripped. Shitty really is hard-working. Su-Yi praised, and then sighed, the matter between Shitty and Luoli Shixiang, I can't really do anything. I heard that Shitty was lacking in Jingshi, I still have some and can relieve Shitty's need. Finishing, he took out 2 pieces of 3rd grade Jingshi. Wuemo blanked. He had a good impression of Su-Yi but didn't have a deep relationship. He had never thought that Su-Yi Shixiang would stand on his side on this matter. The other coming of his own initiative to shove Jingshi at him, it was too strange. And Wuemo was even more surprised by Su-Yi Shixiang's next move. He saw Su-Yi Shixiang take out a silver bracelet and hand it to Wuemo, this is the Star Silver Vambrace. It is a defensive talisman I forged. 2nd grade, able to block 3 attacks from a Ningmai cultivator. Finishing his explanation, he shoved it into Wuemo's chest. Wuemo was confused, and he completely did not understand the situation. Right, does Shitty still have any more of the Great Strength Pill? Su-Yi asked warmly. Great Strength Pill. He didn't know how Su-Yi Shixiang knew about the Great Strength Pill. Looking at the 2 pieces of 3rd grade Jingshi and the shining vambrace on his hands, Wuemo was almost knocked unconscious by the meat pie from the sky. He replied instinctively, nothing left. Then I want to order 100 from Shitty, each one 50 pieces of 2nd grade Jingshi, how about it? Su-Yi stared at Wuemo as he asked. 50 2nd grade Jingshi each one, 100. Was he dreaming? He still hasn't woken up. He looked dumbly at a place not far away, there wasn't the wooden target that Luoli was drawn on. Wasn't dreaming. 100 pills. Each one 50 pieces of 2nd grade Jingshi, he muttered to himself. Right, what does Shitty think? Su-Yi was slightly nervous. Had the world gone crazy? Wuemo looked at Su-Yi Shixiang staring at him and thought dumbly. Does Shitty have some problems? Su-Yi saw that Wuemo hadn't reacted for a long time and couldn't resist asking. No problem, Wuemo's voice was slightly weak. For some reason, he didn't feel any joy. It might be that it felt too unrealistic. Amazing. I just knew that Shitty would definitely help, Su-Yi grinned. He took out 5 pieces of 3rd grade Jingshi and shoved it onto Wuemo's hand, these 5 pieces of 3rd grade Jingshi can be the down payment. Shitty's body is the first priority, don't tire yourself. Shitty doesn't have to send all 100 pills at the same time. Oh, after the sect assessment, don't rush. Suemo dumbly agreed. Seeing Su Yi Shixiang contentedly leave, he still held a dumb expression. He hadn't managed to absorb what just happened. Who could tell him what was going on? Maybe it was really a dream, Suemo thought inside. Maybe in the next instant, he would wake up. And the things on his hands would disappear in a blink. Is Shiji here? Yan Lushirshu's voice sounded from outside the valley. Before Suemo could reply, Yan Lushirwa flew in. When Yan Lu saw Suemo's state, he first stilled and then smiled. Oh, Shitzi really is hard-working. It really seemed that there was great hope for this year's sect assessment. Shirbwa. Suemo didn't dare offend him. Even if his entire body was sore, he still bowed. Yan Lushirwa saw the things in Suemo's arms and then thought of Su Yi who he encountered outside the valley. He couldn't help but curse inside. Su Yi might be collected and calm usually, but his feet were really quick. Just now, I encountered your Su Yi Shixiang. He should have already ordered great strength pill from you. Yan Lu said smilingly. How does Shirbwa know? In the elders, Suemo felt the most harmonious was Yan Lu Shirbwa. How many did he order? Yan Lu asked in response. 100 pills. As expected, the same as second Shixiang, a single move was this vicious. Yan Lu swore inside, but the smile on his face became even more harmonious. Shirbwa has come this time for great strength pill as well. Suemo, whose thoughts had just returned, suddenly stilled. Does Shiji's great strength pill contain sun essence? Yan Lu stared at Suemo as he asked. Yes. Suemo woodenly nodded. Yan Lu clapped his hands and praised, as expected. Suemo was frightened. With a head full of confusion, Suemo finally couldn't bear it and asked, even now, this disciple doesn't understand. Shirbwa, what is going on? Shiji, don't rush, I will tell you all. Only now did Yan Lu tell the result of the appraisal of great strength pill to Suemo fire source. Suemo had seen it before on the records. No matter if it was forging or dan making, as long as it was using the fire method, a fire source was something necessary. The more rare and precious high quality the fire source was, the greater its aid in the process. Especially for those experts in dan and forging, fire source was especially important. Suemo finally understood. What Golden Crow fire exactly was, Suemo wasn't clear, but if it really was a fine one among the 4th grade fire source like Yan Lushirwa said. He instantly understood the value of the dan he made. Golden Crow fire was the object of the dreams of the dan and forging cultivators. Yan Lu was secretly observing Suemo's eyes. It was a pity that Suemo had a zombie face and nothing could be observed. The sect leader hopes that only we could receive the selling rights of the great strength pill from Shiji. As to the price, don't worry, Shiji, we will use the market price. Yan Lu stared at Suemo as he slowly explained. Only selling rights? Suemo unhesitatingly nodded, that isn't a problem. For him, it was the same whoever he sold it to, but his roots were in the sect. If he gave the only selling rights to the sect naturally had to give him an equivalent repayment. The sect leader had always been fair. Suemo was very confident on this point. Yan Lu was very satisfied with Suemo's answer. He thought inside, Suemo's identity and past might not be clear, but he was very loyal to the sect. His expression became even more harmonious. Good, don't worry, we won't treat you unfairly. Other than the market price, the contribution point for each great strength pill will be double. If you are interested in cultivating the sword, in the future, the sect's shapeless sword scripture, empty sword scripture, and the other 4th grade sword scriptures can all be passed to you. Don't fail the hopes that the sect has in you. Right, the name Great Strength Pill is too unpleasant, in the future, it will be changed to Golden Crow Pill. Finishing, he took out a blue vest to hand to Suemo. This is a 2nd grade immortal waterling armor. It's a piece of Shirbwa's goodwill. If you wear it, it will add a bit more protection. Suemo hurried to thank him. Shiji needs to make some soon. Yanlu gave a troubled expression. Right now, your Shiji is being surrounded by people and can't get out. Only selling some Dan can calm them down. He couldn't help but admire sect leader Shixiang's eyes. If they really didn't sell, it was likely that the sect's little store in Dongfu would have been torn down. Wukong's sword sect would have become known to everyone. At that time, it was hard to say if they could still keep Suemo. Suemo was stunned. He hadn't thought that the matter would be like that. He instantly said, "Don't worry, Shibua, this disciple will immediately make a batch." To say nothing of anything else, if Liang Feng Shiji was in trouble he could not ignore it. Yanlu nodded contentedly and after exhorting Suemo again, he finally left. Suemo finally reacted, his eyes large as he became excited. Curiously examining the immortal water Ling armor in his hand, this was the first time he had seen Ling armor. In curiosity, he added in Ling energy. The immortal water Ling armor suddenly turned into a ball of blue water and climbed up his arm, quickly covering his body. He could clearly feel the connection between this Ling armor and him. Was he really going to get rich? He stared dumbly at the immortal water Ling armor on his body. There were still hints of disbelief in his eyes. Chapter 56 Determination Great Strength Pill, no, Golden Crow Pill. The change it caused to Suemo's circumstances was very evident, especially in resolving his financial situation. But no matter if it was Su Yi Shixiang or Yan Lushibua, they all seemed to think Suemo didn't have a chance. This could be seen from the talismans they gave. One gave a vambrace, the other Ling armor. They was all defensive. Clearly, the two were only trying to make it a less ugly ordeal for Suemo. Right now, the problem in front of Suemo was very serious. One was earning Jingshi, the other was practicing sword scripture. Presently, he was in debt. Earning Jingshi was undoubtedly the most pressing. No matter what time, earning Jingshi was the greatest problem he had to face. And cultivating sword scripture, in a very large way, it would decide his outcome when he faced Luo Li's challenge in the sect assessment. This two matters all dragged in a question. Time. If he made Dan, then the time he had to practice sword scripture would drastically shorten. Originally, he didn't have much of a chance at winning. Calculating it that way, Suemo felt his rate of winning was basically zero. In the end, did he want Jingshi or to fight for his honor? Suemo became trapped in a dilemma. "Yi, what have you been up to recently?" The pink paper crane flew in, the same graceful writing. "Practicing the sword." "Oh, when did you become so vigorous?" "I'm not very used to it. Going up against a cold and perverted man." He, what happened?" "His woman flirted with me, got slapped. He came to get back." Suemo gave it a bit of improvement. Oh, it could be considered flirtation, Suemo thought. "Chop him." A strong bandit aura came through the two graceful words. Suemo, a man, blushed with shame. But right now there's a really good chance to earn lots of Jingshi. Suemo, for some strange reason, wrote down his dilemma. Gentlemen can be killed, but cannot be humiliated. Just measly Jingshi. Do not let me look down on ye. Just measly Jingshi. As expected from those that didn't know hunger and thirst. Suemo was reflecting. Why did he ask such an unreliable person? He disdainfully replied, "Woman, what gentleman are you?" His gaze uncontrollably stopped for a while on the "gentleman can be killed but cannot be humiliated." I only hope for ye to display his masculinity. Ye's going to work. Don't reply. Suemo returned the words and threw the brush to one side. Suemo spent one day working hard in the Dan room. He gave all the golden crow pills he made to Yan Lushibua to free Liang Feng Shiji from her predicament. Before the sect assessment, Mo decided not to make any more. He decided to put all his time on practicing the sword. Whenever he thought about Luo Li and Hao Min's face, his entire body was filled with the urge to fight. Why did he earn Jingshi? Wasn't it to become strong? Wasn't it to become strong and be able to find the answer? After thinking it through, he didn't hesitate any longer. Hesitance, indecisiveness, it was all brushed away. Mo felt the world suddenly became light, his mind clear, unspeakably comfortable. Returning to West Wind Valley, he took up Ice Crystal Sword and started to practice Li Water Sword scripture, over and over. He closed off the valley and he had hanged up a sign saying, "In seclusion, do not disturb." This quickly became a joke in Wukong Sword Sect. Mo had come out of the outer sect disciples, the incident with Hao Min made others feel he was too arrogant. Adding on the hot sales of Golden Crow Pill, there were many that were jealous. Many people were looking to see his joke. This was the difference. Luo Li's attitude was cold and arrogant, but people were only in awe and found it matter of fact. And Mo slapping Hao Min, even though it was first Hao Min's fault, but people didn't like seeing it. Just at this time, Qin Cheng Shixiang came back. Qin Cheng Shixiang was the student of the sect leader. His cultivation wasn't the highest, nor was his attack power. But he was born authoritative, deeply trusted by others and had a high reputation. Luo Li and Qin Cheng sat facing each other. Qin Cheng had a square face and thick brows. His clothes were dusty, the exhaustion in his brows unable to be covered. But sitting there, he naturally gave off an aura of authority. Qin Cheng lectured, "You were too brash. Taking Hao Min Shiji for this long and not returning, no wonder sect leader was angry." Facing Qin Cheng, the iciness on Luo Li's face dissolved slightly. He was unconcerned, as long as she's happy. Facing his shitty, Qin Cheng was helpless. How his shimmy Hao Min's personality was, he knew very well. He could only change the topic. "Have you improved recently?" Luo Li said proudly, "5th level." Qin Cheng gave a comforted expression. He took out a jade scroll. "This is shapeless sword scripture. Take it and study it well." When Luo Li heard the words, shapeless sword scripture, the light in his eyes brightened. Wei Xing has entered the sword cave, the sect leader and others have high hopes for him and must be hoping that he could recover, void sword scripture. Qin Cheng glanced at Luo Li, "He once was your sword servant, you cannot lose to him." Luo Li's expression was abnormally ugly, his fists clenching, unfeeling of the nails biting into his flesh. This matter, it had been a thorn in his heart. That pathetic person that he had ordered around before, the attentions paid to him now in the sect far surpassed himself. Whenever he thought about it, it was like there were worms chewing on his heart. In the past, Void Sword was split into Shapeless Sword Scripture and Empty Sword Scripture. If the Sword Scripture could be split, it can be merged again. Wei Xing might have outstanding your talent, but I've always been confident in Shidi's talents. Qin Cheng said slowly, "I hope that this can recover the glory of the founder on Shidi's hands." Luo Li's breathing became rushed. He stared at the jade scroll on his hand, his expression changing. Void Sword Scripture, this name that he had dreamed countless times about. The highest skill that the founder of the sect had created. In the countless techniques of the world, it ranked 6th grade, immensely powerful. Recover the founder's glory. Shixiang's words were like thunder from the heavens, echoing by his ears. The blood in his body seemed to have been light up. He seemed to see himself standing in the clouds, looking down at the world. Barely suppressing the excitement in his heart, he put away the jade stick and bowed slightly, stating seriously, "Shidi will try the best." Wukong Hall, Pei Yuan Ran and Xin Yen were drinking tea. After killing Yao last time in the Ling fields, when they had the free time, they would gather to drink tea and chat. "It's a pity that third Shidi isn't here, otherwise we three would have gathered again." Pei Yuan Ran smiled, "He's probably going to be busy for a while." Xin Yen drank his tea. He was different in the way he drank, completely lacking the grace and idleness that other people had. Whenever Pei Yuan Ran would pour it full for him, he would raise it and drink to the bottom. Clean and crisp. After that, he poured it for himself, drinking cup after cup. Drinking like you, it really is wasting my Ling tea. Pei Yuan Ran was in pain. Xin Yen didn't even look at him, not stopping. He asked, "What Tian Song Zi said, how about it?" Pei Yuan Ran's face became serious. "It's not unreasonable." Third Shitty had been complaining a while ago that the price of Ling grains had risen astronomically. It is a little hint. How do you feel? Xin Yen stopped for the first time. He nodded his head. I feel it's true. Why? Hunting Yao is getting harder and harder. Xin Yen said, on the market, the number of Yao inner cores have become less and the price has multiplied. I forgot that you also forge. Pei Yuan Ran nodded in agreement. It's true that there are less people willing to hunt Yao. Even those big sects, they put their direction onto searching for new Jia. The words of the two were filled with worry. 3,000 years, the Xiuzhe had defeated the Yaomo. The remaining strong Yaomo had used their own bodies and blood as the guide, 7 medium Jia as the axis, 49 little Jia as the screen to create Bloody Sky Metropolis Jia. Ling energy in Bloody Sky Metropolis Jia was extremely lacking, extremely disadvantageous for Xiuzhe. Yaomo, on the other hand, were not affected. This meant that Bloody Sky Metropolis Jia became the Yaomo's most trusted defensive line. But in these 3,000 years, the attacks of Xiuzhe against Bloody Sky Metropolis Jia had never stopped. Bloody Sky Metropolis Jia had become a constant battlefield. Countless cultivators had become famous there. Many things on the body of Yaomo were rare materials for Xiuzhe. Forging, dan making, food, it was all useful. The stronger the Yaomo, the higher the value. Therefore, many people went for the Yaomo and then this exercise had its own name, Yao Hunt. However, in the recent long period, there were less and less people going to Yao Hunt. The continuously appearing Yaomo strong masters caused the casualty rate of the cultivators in Yao Hunt to be extremely high. The risk was too high, the profits shrunk and caused the number of cultivators in Yao Hunt to decrease dramatically. And in the last few years, the active area of cultivators in Bloody Sky Metropolis Jia kept retreating. Incidents where Yaomo actively attacked Xiuzhe had occurred. Everything was hinting that the Yaomo had recovered. All the cultivators who had at least some foresight were full of worry. If Yaomo could push the Xiuzhe out of Bloody Sky Metropolis Jia, that meant that they could start an attack on Xiuzhe at any time. There wasn't any room for diplomacy between Xiuzhe and Yaomo. 3,000 years ago, the Xiuzhe almost exterminated all Yaomo. Only now have they recovered, and the hatred between them were as deep as the sea. If another great war like the one that occurred 3,000 years ago happened again, not one Xiuzhe would be unaffected. He wants to host a Dong Fu sword test conference. Why would Tian Songzi mention Zhuomo's name? Xin Yen asked. He is only a Ling plant farmer. In the letter Tian Songzi gave Pei Yuan Ran, he said he would host a sword test conference. Inside, he had specifically mentioned Wei Sheng and Zhuomo's names. Don't know. Pei Yuan Ran grimaced, probably that the incident with Golden Crow Pill had been too big and attracted Tian Songzi's attention. Right, who do you feel about that youth, Yu Bai? Not bad, stronger than Luo Li. Wei Sheng. Hard to say. It seems that Tian Songzi's branch will have a successor. Pei Yuan Ran drawled, Zhuo Mei Tian's disciple supposedly isn't bad. If there really is a Dong Fu sword test conference, it would be a bit interesting. Xin Yen didn't speak and started to drink another cup of tea. After a while, he raised his head. You agreed? No rush, have to wait for Wei Sheng to come out of the sword cave. Even more, the sect assessment is starting. Pei Yuan Ran smiled. have you heard about the matter between Luo Li and Zuemo? Winning dishonorably. Xin Yen spat out. Huh, that's true. Pei Yuanran laughed. A beat later, he said, Luo Li's talents isn't bad, but his personality is a bit lacking. If he's like Wei Sheng, Xin Yen rolled his eyes, don't be greedy. Huh, Pei Yuanran laughed again. Chapter 57 Like Fire 5923. Zuomo's mouth was wide as he panted heavily, his eyes bulging like a fish before death as he stared at the ice crystal sword floating in front of him. He was like a bamboo stalk swaying in the wind, his body trembling. The clothing was soaked, pasted to his body and revealing his thin stature. Bam, he fell down. He lost control of the ice crystal sword in midair and with a clang, it dropped to the ground. Weakly looking at the sky, Zuomo's brain was ringing. The last bit of Ling energy had been cleanly wrung out. 5,923 times. If he sliced 4,000 more times, he would reach 10,000. He hadn't wasted his time slicing 5,923 times. Any move in Li Water Sword scripture, right now, he could unthinkingly complete it in one breath, with no pauses or raw spots. But it was only the sword moves. The sword moves were the appearance, the sword essence was the bones. Sword moves without sword essence, it was like a paper tiger, only appearing frightening. Each sword scripture, the sword essence they had was different. Even in the same sword scripture, different cultivators would form different sword essences. What Zuomo had comprehended was Xin Yen Shishu's tidal sword essence and not Li Water sword essence. Only a matching sword essence could merge with the sword moves into one. When he had sliced 4,000 times, Zuomo realized this rule. The tidal sword essence he had secretly learned from Xin Yen Shibua, it would only have the greatest effect with its matching sword moves. He might have used the sword energy from the golden sword ring to form it one, but Zuomo postulated, it was either because the sword energy of the gold ring sword was too low or that he had performed abnormally well that time. He had tried countless times but was still unable to merge the tidal sword essence into the sword moves of Li Water sword scripture. The two were like two completely different entities, unable to tolerate each other. If Zuomo hadn't comprehended a sword essence, he wouldn't be facing this problem. But after personally experiencing being sliced so many times, the power and greatness of sword essence had already been struck into his heart. A power that easily could slice a soul. Compared to that, the beautiful and grand sword moves were only pretty but not practical. Sword essence, this was undoubtedly the question he cared about the most. There wasn't much time. He had no method to rely on himself to find it, so he could only go find Pu Yao. Want to know? Aha. Pu Yao gave an intoxicating smile. Zuomo proactively threw the jingsher that he gained from making the golden crow pills to Pu Yao. It seems that we have connected on a deeper level now. Pu Yao gave a light laugh and then said absent-mindedly, of course the sword essence from each sword scripture is different. Do you need to think about such an idiotic question? Go comprehend Li Water sword essence. Just find a river, go look, what is water? Oh, as to fire, there it is. Zuomo scanned the surroundings. The deep red flames seemed leaped to attention, the flames sprouting higher. Open your eyes and take a good look. It won't be free next time. Pu Yao's voice came out from the sea of fire. The consciousness was entirely fiery red, the flames dancing rapidly. Countless deep red flames slowly started to rise. It was like countless red flowers blooming in the sky. Each ball of flame was jumping at a certain rhythm. The outer red flames were like the tongues of snakes, spitting randomly. The whole sky was filled with balls of flames. Suddenly, they all started to head for the center. The entire process was done without a sound, like water flowing into the ocean, not a ripple was made. An enormous flame rose in Zuomo's sea of consciousness. It exchanged light with the star in the void. It burned quietly. None of the flame flowers could be seen. What could be seen was a red-black sun. A pure red color, as though it was made from crimson metal liquid. Some places were so red it was black. On the surface of the ball, dense flames spit and spat. Hot. Suemo felt as if he was in a stove. A wave of heat rushed over. His entire body seemed to be roasting over a fire. He actually felt a strong burning pain. He was stunned. Everything in the sea of consciousness wasn't material. Even he was just a bit of spirit. Like these flames, in the past, no matter if they took over the consciousness, Suemo hadn't felt any heat. But this time, this red ball so hot it was almost black, it made him frightened. The ball of fire serenely floated in midair, burning quietly. But this quiet held agitation and danger. It made Suemo feel awe. The quiet here was like a thin layer of eggshell, able to break at any time. Just at this time, the ball of flame exploded without a warning. Suemo saw an extremely awe-inspiriting picture. Countless red-black flames flowed like a volcano's lava flows, heading in all directions. The flames were like rain. Everything that Suemo could see was dyed red. The countless flames colored the black sky crimson red. Big and small flames, after the shock of the initial high-speed impact, their speed slowed down. A sky full of fire flowers, they floated slowly like red dandelion seeds blown by the wind, traveling where the wind blew. The scorching heat caused the air to warp, making the scene seem unrealistic. Suemo stood dumbstruck in his spot. Suddenly, he remembered that black sea, the picture of the countless black dandelion seeds flying. The dark red flames jumping in air finally landed on the ground. Once they landed, it was like they grew roots and quickly spread. In the blink of an eye, Suemo was surrounded by a sea of fire. Everything returned to normal. But this sea of fire didn't give off a feeling of burning. He dazedly reached out a hand, and like it didn't exist, the hand traveled through the flames. Was this fire? What he had just seen gave him a shock that he had never had before. In the next few days, Suemo's mind was in a trance. The scene in the sea of consciousness continuously repeated in front of his eyes. Like a puppet, he lost his soul, muddled. The bewitching scene full of power, every detail, it was like it was burned into his mind. Like fire. Xiaoguo wiped her sweat. Seeing that mark on the wooden board in front of her, a happy expression appeared on her naive and adorable apple face. She could send out a sword energy now. Also, this was not relying on the aid of the golden sword ring that Suemo Shixiang had given her, but a sword energy she had made based on her own cultivation. She had persisted in practicing the jade scroll that Suemo had given her last time. She didn't know how she had come through this time. The things in the jade stick were not complicated, but to a girl who had stayed in the zoo from very little, the difficulty was like trying to ascend the heavens. Sweat, tiredness, pain, incorrect, not understanding, lost. In secret, she had cried so many times that even she didn't know. Cried until her eyes were like peaches. But after crying each time, she would start practicing again. Pain, tiredness, and then cry, and then start practicing. That pair of soft and tender hands, right now, it had a bit of strength and power. Shiji became an inner sect disciple, Shixiang also became an inner sect disciple. Her pink fists tightened, that pair of bright eyes full of resolve. Xiaoguo will definitely become an inner sect disciple. Before, there had been Shiji protecting her, after, it had been Shixiang. Even though Shixiang was a bit ugly, and his temper wasn't good, but, unknowingly, Xiaoguo felt that this Shixiang that she was slightly afraid of became her role model. Especially when Shixiang gave the jade scrolls to her and told her to practice hard and protect everyone else, Xiaoguo made a decision, she would do her best. Tilting her head, she thought innocently. Xiaoguo, Xiaoguo. Someone was calling her. Hey. She hurriedly responded. A few of the Shiji ran over and said, "Let's go together to Dongfu, it's been so long since we went. Come with us." No one knew she was practicing sword scriptures. She would always sneak away to practice every day by herself. She really didn't want to go. She still hadn't finished her practice for today. When she was going to decline, she suddenly remembered that Shixiang said to her to protect everyone. When the word reached her mouth, it became, okay. Dongfu Hall, Yu Bai was reporting to Tian Songzi, the letters and invitations have all been sent out. Wukong Sword Sect and Dongqi Sword Sect, it had been this disciple personally delivering them. It was hard for you. Tian Songzi nodded in praise. He suddenly remembered something and ordered, for the next while, make sure to control the people in the city. Pay attention that nothing will happen. Is something going to happen? Yu Bai hurriedly asked. Still remember the stars in daytime? Remember. Has there been any discoveries? Yu Bai's heart shook. That strange and odd marvel, he probably wouldn't forget it in his lifetime. The apparition of Wei Xing's Juji had been sword energy reaching the heavens, stunning him greatly. But in comparison, that quietly appearing, stars that appeared without a sign in the sky, what he felt was a bone-aching cold. Tian Songzi shook his head, nothing. The Jia master had scanned the entire Jia with his mind and hadn't found any abnormalities. But, when Jia master asked for help from his sect, he found that stars in daytime are related to Yamo. Yamo? Yu Bai cried out. Right. But, even in the oldest texts, the records about it are very vague. They only say that it is related to Yamo. Tian Songzi's face was heavy, and he said in a deep voice, most importantly, it is a great ominous omen. Ominous omen. Yu Bai's face slightly paled. Apparitions, even though they weren't common, but they would occasionally appear. When a treasure came out of the ground, when someone had a breakthrough in cultivation, forging or dan-making, they all could create apparitions. But of the apparitions that could be called an ominous omen, Yu Bai only knew a few of them. And each one of them all meant the sky and earth changing, blood flowing in rivers. Like when a Jia was going to shatter, the land would crack, water would flow in the sky, that was an ominous omen. Under such circumstances, even those of the highest cultivation could not escape. They would be destroyed with the Jia, turned to nothing. Tian Songzi sighed, the world is going to have an upheaval. Yamo is going to rise. He glanced at Yu Bai and then said, do not worry too much. Yamo is the natural enemies of all Shouja. On this point, no matter which sect, they would not retreat. This time, Sky Guard Jia has sent quite a few strong people who will soon arrive at Sky Moon Jia to investigate this matter. The cultivators all have high cultivation. To avoid conflict, you need to put effort into restricting the people. Don't create a disorder. Remember to notify all the sections. Yes. Yu Bai hurried complied. Hopefully they will resolve it. Tian Songzi muttered to himself. Yu Bai was silent. He didn't know how to comfort master. Chapter 58 Terror 9411. After dazing around for 3 days, Suemo started to furiously practice sword moves again. The picture in his sea of consciousness gave an unparalleled shock. He seemed to have understood something, but couldn't grasp it. 3 days later, he suddenly woke and understood. All kinds of comprehension, it wasn't a building in the sky. Without a solid base, even if you understood it, you could not produce it. Even more, Suemo didn't understand sword essence completely. Wei Xing Shixiang had sat in front of the waterfall for months, battled lots of times, before he had comprehended just those basic things. His talent at the sword was far from Wei Xing Shixiang. How could it be so easy? Finally knowing where the problem was, Mo controlled his panicking heart and started to practice the sword moves of Li Water Sword Scripture. When he was tired to his limits, his Ling energy used up, he would meditate in the rock room. Recovering, he would start again. Just like this, without a break in between. 19,022. Mo's clothing was torn, his body a mess, his eyes sunk deep. Only that pair of eyes were lit up like a fire, burning relentlessly. 7 moves. Each detail of each move, he had thought it over countless times. He was so familiar to a point that he couldn't even believe it. The ice crystal sword was like a part of his body. He could easily control it to do any move. That bit of consciousness, it was like a strong spider silk thread that held on to the sword. In the air, the ice crystal sword slowly wavered like a fish waving its tail as it swam against the current. The rate at which the ice crystal sword wavered continuously increased. With the ice crystal sword as the center, large circles of transparent ripples appeared in the air. Mo's eyes were slightly closed as he tasted the tiniest changes on the ice crystal sword. Without a sound, the ice crystal sword suddenly disappeared from its spot, only leaving behind transparent ripples that shook in the air. Ding! A sound that was the lightest possible. The ice crystal sword entered into the rock face of the valley, leaving behind a small hole. After a while, the rock surrounding the tiny hole became covered in a dense yet thin layer of ice. The sword was like water, illusory and shapeless. Mo closed his eyes, reminiscing on the entire process. The path the ice crystal sword had taken was actually a curve. Like water flowing down a mountain, extremely natural and smooth. This move, flowing water, according to the words of Li Water Sword Scripture, it was a small progress. But Mo was very dissatisfied. If this move had sword essence, the sword would have gone beyond the 3 feet into the rock. There was someone in the valley. Mo felt it in his heart. In this amount of time, other than practice sword scripture, all his other time was put onto meditation. Other than the improvement of his sword scripture, his cultivation had increased ferociously. Shiji. Mo saw it was Li Yingfeng and got off his guard. Li Yingfeng saw Mo's state and jumped. Then she frowned. Shitty, fighting is important, but speed isn't everything. If you are too exhausted, it would have the opposite effect. Mo, I'm fine. For you. Li Yingfeng couldn't deal with Mo and handed over a jade scroll. Su Yi Xia Shiji came back. This is a jade scroll that she gave me. Recorded inside is one of the times that Luo Li Shixiang was fighting. If you have the time, you could take a look. Mo stilled. He hadn't thought that there was this matter and couldn't help but be curious. Before Wei Xing Shixiang had Juji, Luo Li Shixiang had always been the genius of the sect. Even Wei Xing Shixiang was just his sword servant. Mo was very curious what level he really was at. Looking at Li Yingfeng Shiji who looked slightly tired, he was grateful, and raised his hands. He said, "Many thanks, Shiji." It was just a coincidence that Su Yi Xia Shiji returned. Li Yingfeng said, "Shiji needs to work hard. Not just Su Yi Xia Shiji has returned. Supposedly, eldest Shiji is also returning soon. And, I will." Mo said resolutely. Li Yingfeng added a few more cautions before leaving. Returning to the valley, Mo impatiently added Ling energy to the jade scroll. It looked like the battlefield was a mine underground. The light was poor, and it was very dark. Mo couldn't help but furrow his brows. He didn't know if it was that he was used to sunlight but he really didn't like this kind of dark underground place. Suppressing the dislike inside, his head turned quickly. This should be the mind that Luo Li governed. Luo Li Shixiang's personality was cold and his relationship with the other Shixiang wasn't very good. Supervising a sect was a hard duty. It was long-term underground, dull and harsh. Other than Luo Li Shixiang, no one was willing to go. Zuomo looked extremely carefully, afraid of missing a detail. He saw a crowd of people facing Luo Li Shixiang. Brothers, since we can't even get full, it's just a death. Rather than starve to death, we should rather fight against him. Someone shouted. But his shaking legs clearly betrayed the terror in his heart. The other people shook all over as well, but their eyes were red. Zuomo remembered that he had heard of Shou slaves from the sound tablet. These people should be Shou slaves. Seeing these people's eyes, Zuomo suddenly thought, when a wild animal was in desperate straits, were they like this as well? Huang Zhe, I promoted you to head, and you repay me like this? Luo Li said coldly. Head. The leader of the crowd smiled bitterly, can't even live, what's the use in being the head? The Jingshi under is becoming rare, the rules didn't chance. One piece of Jingshi exchanged for that little bit of food. We've continuous to dig down. The corrosion from the earth energy is even stronger. The month before last, 10 of us died. Last month, 30 of us died. It's only been half of this month, but 35 have already died. The crowd was very excited. The people that had been trembling were not trembling any longer. Their eyes didn't have any more terror, only rage. Luo Li looked indifferently at these people, hope. Since there isn't ing hope. The person's eyes were bloodshot as he howled, we'll just ask for an enjoyment. Enjoyment? Luo Li suddenly opened coldly, then I will give you enjoyment. As his words landed, without a warning, a bloodline appeared on the people's necks. The excited and uncontrolled people didn't detect it. Pew pew pew. Blood sprayed out from their neck. Dozens of blood pillars sprayed at the same time, the warm blood being sprayed everywhere onto the top and sides of the cavern. Large sections of red, alarming to the eye. Between the sounds of blood spraying, there was the sound of rolling. The heads of these Shou slaves rolled beside the feet of their corpses. Dozens of corpses were standing as they sprayed blood. The heads by the feet were perfect and untouched, the features clear. It was even possible to see the expression and large eyes of these Shou slaves before their death. After a while, these headless corpses finally fell down. Arg, seeing this, Zuomo's chest started to roil. He couldn't contain it and crouching on the ground, he started to throw up. He had never thought that one day, he would see such a terrifying and bloody picture. His body tightened. Was that person, like a monster, uncaring of other people's live, was that Luo Li Shixiang? A long time ago, he had heard that Luo Li Shixiang's temper wasn't good, but now he understood that Luo Li Shixiang's bad temper was very different than the one he understood. Shou slaves, were they Shou slaves? But why did Shou slaves seem no different than him? This thought only flashed in his mind. Zuomo had never thought he was a person that bemoaned the state of the universe and pitied others. In his perspective, he had no qualification to pity others. He himself was struggling at the lowest level of society. Even though he was now an inner sect disciple, a Ling plant farmer, but he was still only a little person. His gaze landed on those corpses, the heads, and the fresh blood that had sprayed everywhere. Shixiang's gaze was cold, indifferent. The picture in front of his eyes, it seemed to be a very normal thing in the eyes of Shixiang. Zuomo felt that he was shuddering, trembling, unable to control his fear. In these 2 years, he spent every day in the Ling fields. He had never thought that one day, he would face fresh blood and corpses. Would Luo Li, during the sect assessment, kill him off? Or take off one of his limbs? Zuomo's brain turned to a mess. Terror spread through his entire body like the red-black fire in his sea of consciousness. He was afraid. Heavy Sword Hall was the place that Qin Cheng resided in normally. Even though he had left for a time, but someone still had taken care of it. Inside the hall, everyone was in a pile, extremely lively. Qin Cheng smiled, us brothers, it's been so long since we gathered. Being able to gather today, we should drink. Su-yi hurriedly waved his hand, tea, we're not drinking wine. A green-clad female sat beside Su-yi, delicate and adorable. She was Su-yi Xia. She mischievously poked out her tongue, second Shixiang is still this weak, no improvement. Su-yi was helpless against his shimmy. Su-yi Xia was naughty and adorable, her personality cheerful, and understood how to gain the affections of the elders. She was the most favored one of the disciples. Su-yi had suffered on her hands and could only grimace. Luo Li sat on the side, unconcernedly drinking tea, his face cold. Hao Min sat beside him. At this time, she couldn't help say, "It's great that everyone has returned. If you haven't returned, those bastards would have climbed onto our heads." Hearing Hao Min's unpleasant words, Su-yi and Su-yi Xia's expression became slightly irritated. Shimmy shall not speak nonsense. We are all disciples of the same sect. If the sect leader heard, you will be punished again. Qin Cheng berated. He had always been authoritative. Hearing this, Hao Min could only stay quiet. However, Qin Cheng's tone turned as he looked at everyone else. We know each other and grew up together, we are like brothers. Helping each other, that's reasonable. He continued, the elders have their own ideas, but we have our own feelings. Everyone nodded. They had grown up together from little. Having someone else entering, they naturally were unwilling. He. Su-yi Xia said naughtily, exactly. Even though Luo Li Shixiang has a cold face all the time, but I will still help you. I gave that jade stick where Shixiang killed 30 Shou slaves with one sword to Li Yingfeng. It must be on the little zombie's hands by now. How can you reveal your Shixiang sword moves? Hearing this, Hao Min was enraged. Su-yi Xia wasn't scared of Hao Min at all. She helplessly rolled her eyes, this is called a mental attack. That little zombie, he just farms, where would he have seen something like that? Even I was scared half to death seeing it. I'm guessing that he'll just faint. Putting down a seed of fear in his ear, he will. Luo Li suddenly stood up. His face dark, he said in a cold voice, against a Ling plant farmer, do I, Luo Li, need such cheap tricks? Finishing, his head not turning back, he left. Chapter 59 Practicing Sword in the Waters. Mo was stunned. The picture inside the jade scroll gave him an earth-shattering shock. The following days, he would wake up at night. The bloody and terrifying scene tormented him like a nightmare. In the Ling fields, he dazedly sat, his mind unfocused, his complexion extremely poor. Looking at the Ling grasses and herbs that were growing well in the fields, he suddenly felt that his life had changed a lot, completely different than before. Why was it like that? He asked himself. He suddenly remembered that strange dream that had puzzled him for 2 years. The slightly familiar voice in the dream. Unconsciously, he couldn't help compare the nightmare of the last 2 days to the frequently repeating dream. Compared to the nightmare of the last few days, the usual dream didn't have a bit of blood. But whenever he was shocked awake, it was like he had been lifted out of the water, his entire body soaked. It clearly wasn't a bloody and scary dream, but it always made him so nervous, terrified. Yes, terrified. When he woke, other than sweat, there was also his stiff body. He didn't know when he was dreaming, what his sleeping body was like. But undoubtedly, he was definitely afraid. But he didn't know what he was afraid of. That dream, it was the reason that he was pursuing power. He believed that there was really something behind the dream. That, you must not forget even in death, damn it, what is it? Suddenly the blood and the headless corpses became less scary in Zhuomo's eyes. For some reason, the frequent yet not scary dream, the terror that it brought Zhuomo far outweighed those bloody scenes. What was he doing? Zhuomo suddenly seemed to have woken up. He hit his head heavily. Why did he get scared by just that scene? To search for the answer, wasn't he willing to put his life on the line? This world, what was more frightening than having the same dream repeating each night? This world, what was more frightening than clearly knowing you had something important you shouldn't forget but could not remember? What was more frightening than have your features changed and mind erased but you were still safe? Zhuomo's blank eyes slowly focused, his eyes resuming clarity and brightness. What was he afraid of? Wasn't it just his life? He told himself inside. If he wanted to search for answer, he would definitely encounter people countless times more dangerous, and more powerful. If he couldn't get through this barrier, if he retreated from this step, how could he search for answers? The person who changed his features and erased his mind was a powerful person who even Master was wary of. Zhuo stood up. After thinking it through, his mind became clear. Unknowingly, his mental state and cultivation improved hugely. He had comprehended something. Cultivation, it was to have a steady heart, and not waver. Once again, he took up the ice crystal sword, once again starting to practice. There wasn't loss, there wasn't confusion. He was even more hardworking than before. He needed to catch up all the time he had wasted previously. In the time of 2 months, Zhuo didn't leave the mountain valley. Seeing that there was only 1 month until the sect assessment, Zhuo still didn't have any hint of the Li water sword essence. 20,001. The familiarity of the sword moves had progressed to an abnormal level. Zhuo was suspicious that even the person who made this sword scripture wasn't as familiar as him on the sword moves. 7 sword moves. He had changed it 12 times. Countless practice allowed him to know every detail of the sword moves like the back of his hand. The places where he made alterations, it was places that he thought the sword move would become more logical and effective. Even though he was very uncertain, he still made the change. He was extremely cautious and prudent about the 12 changes. Each change, he had spent large amounts of effort. Practicing over and over to confirm before finally clinching it. On the sword moves, there wasn't any more possible progress. When he realized this, there was only 1 month until the sect assessment. He decided to do something different. There was a large river below Wukong Mountain. The records room of Wukong Mountain had been built beside the cliff. This river couldn't be considered wide but it ran fast. The locals called it sky-shaking rivers. Mo came to the shore. Looking at the rushing water, he gritted his teeth, and carrying the ice crystal sword, he jumped into the river. Entering the river, he felt the surroundings become quiet. The rapid river water almost swept him off his feet. He forced himself to steady and started to do the sword moves of Li water sword scripture, in the water. This was the solution he had thought of. Just when he didn't know what to do, he suddenly remembered a sentence that Pu Yao had said. Pu Yao said for him to find a river and see what water was like. Because what he had seen in his sea of consciousness had been too shocking, he had simply forgotten Pu Yao's words. Only yesterday did he remember. In the past, practicing finger motions in the water was also this method and it allowed his finger motions improve rapidly. Actually, where he wanted to go was the large waterfall that Wei Xing Shixiang had written about, but there wasn't enough time. With no other alternative, he could only choose the sky-shaking river under the mountain to cultivate. The sky-shaking river, while not as large as the large waterfall, the currents were extremely rapid. And because there was a dense layer of rock on the riverbed, there were countless whirlpools in the undercurrent. If he wasn't careful, it was extremely easy to be washed away by the water. Zhuo cultivated embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, and his breathing was unique compared to normal people. This allowed him to be able to stay under the water for a longer period of time. If one hadn't practiced spells like Art of Water Manipulation, they couldn't stay long in the water. Of course, if they had talismans such as a water bubble, then it was a whole other discussion. Zhuo had broken through to one breath in the cold pond and wasn't afraid of water. But the restless river water and the silent and icy pond water gave Zhuo completely different feelings. The cold pond in Cold Mist Valley was like a bottomless hole. Sinking down, it was like entering a silent world, everything on the outside blocked off. There were no currents, no whirlpools. The further down, the more the coldness could be felt. It just silently released its will. And sky-shaking river, jumping in, Mo felt he went from a noisy world into another noisy world. The slapping of the current, the sound of the foams, the innumerable undercurrents and eddies deep down, it pull on everything in the river. It was like a wild stallion, violent and mad, completely lacking the serenity of water. It was continuously roaring, surging endlessly. He quickly felt it a strain. The so-called manipulation of sword, it meant using a strand of spirit to control the flying sword. A sword that had been impressed would have the unique impression of the owner's spirit. And the owner only needed to maneuver one strand of spirit to control the flying sword. They also didn't have to worry that their sword would be controlled by someone else. But in the water, using the spirit to maneuver the sword became much more difficult. Especially since the flow of Ling energy was also affected. It wasn't easy in the first place to get to a calm mind. Due to the undercurrents at the bottom of the river, the water flowed quickly. No matter if the body was controlled in the water, there was still the feeling of countless hands pulling at the body. This effect of this outside force easily distracted cultivators. And any change in the Ling energy would create a huge perturbation for the flying sword. The smooth sword moves that were so familiar on land, not one of them could be completed in sky-shaking river. Mo's eyes couldn't help but light up. What he was afraid of was he would not know how to continue. Just like someone who wanted to dig a mountain road. What he was most afraid of being ignorant of which direction to dig, not knowing his own location. And if he knew where he was, even if there was a mountain blocking, Mo wasn't afraid. He had a feeling he found the right path. He started to faithfully practice his Li Water Sword Scripture. Li Water Sword Scripture was a water element sword scripture. When it was done on the ground, it would have a faint water vapor. But in the water, the power of Li Water Sword Scripture increased exponentially. It didn't need much Ling energy to have multiple shapeless water swords spreading out in the water. Mo felt that it was like he was an infant holding an axe. One careless mistake, if it wasn't too much strength, it was a wrong direction. Adding on the battering of the river water, the disturbance of the currents and eddies, his sword moves were hurtful to the eyes. But he wasn't discouraged. He started to scrupulously practice Li Water Sword Scripture. After a few days, what Mo felt most profoundly about, wasn't his sword moves, but the imprinting method of Li Water Sword Scripture. The Li Water Sword Scripture's imprinting method for the sword was to nurture one drop of water essence in the flying sword. It could respond to the Li Water Sword Scripture, not just aiding in the manipulation, the strength also increased. How could the humidity on the land be as plentiful as in the river? Mo had practiced for so long in the yard, but the amount of water essence he had accumulated was far less than what he got these few days. Before, the water crystal in the ice crystal sword was the size of a mung bean. It was now the size of a soybean. And the appearance of that water essence droplet in the ice crystal sword was different at the core. The previous water essence droplet, it had been created from the water from the valley. There were large amounts of ling grasses and herbs growing in the valley that affected the water vapor in the valley. The water essence formed before was gentle and full of vitality. But the enlarged water essence was created by extracting the essence from the sky-shaking river. It held some of the attributes of the sky-shaking river. The warm quality had vanished and it became hyperactive. This change was both good and bad. The good was that it was much stronger than before. The bad was the ease of manipulation wasn't as good as before. Evaluating it, Mo still felt the present state wasn't bad. The water essence droplet had gotten much larger. As to purity, it needed to be refined slowly. The next 7 days, Mo was almost always practicing in the water. He could stay for a long time in the water, but due to the fact that the Ling energy used underwater was multiple times what was used on land, after practicing for a length of time, he had to meditate to recover Ling energy. But the river was very far from the rock room and it would be extremely eye-catching to travel back. Suemo decided to meditate in the river. Suemo had never tried before to meditate in the river, much less such a strong river. Quite a few times, he wasn't successful. After failing over 10 times, he finally managed to grasp the trick and started to meditate in the water. He didn't know that staying in such a special environment in the water was extremely helpful for his embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. Unknowingly, his embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation broke into second breath. In his sea of consciousness, another star appeared. But this star was dull and colorless, far less blinding than the other one. Chapter 60 Comprehension. The rushing river water roared thunderously, creating large patches of snow-white foam. Occasionally, leaves and wood would be pulled in and disappear in the blink of an eye. Under the roaring surface, Suemo, half naked, had a serious expression on his face. In front of him, several water swords intersected and wove in the water. When fish and shrimp were thrown into this, they were killed without a mark. Suemo didn't rest or sleep. Without pausing, he furiously practiced the sword 33,600. The ice crystal sword was like the nimblest of fish, cheerfully swimming easily in the water. The speed was fast like lightning, shaming those fish that were renowned for speed. Suemo stopped. He might be exhausted, and his mind was pretty much at its limits, but he didn't slack off in the slightest. His eyes were full of tiredness, but he tried to widen time, almost as though he was afraid if his eyes accidentally would close. Tired. He knew he had reached a barrier. The 7 moves of Li Water Sword Scripture, the first 6 moves, he didn't have any problems. The problem came on the 7th move. The first 6 moves, it flowed, or turned like a whirlpool. It mimicked the uniqueness of water, each move having a unique attribute. Suemo was able to understand that. However, even now, Suemo did not get the 7th move. Before, on land, he had felt that he was extremely familiar with the 7th move, but when he got into the water, he felt that it was incorrect. The name of the 7th move was slightly scary. It was called, Li Water Burning Heavens. Suemo felt that if the name was changed to, Li Fire Burning Heavens, he could still understand. But Li Water, that was still water, how could it burn the heavens? This move was one that wounded both sides. It required putting all the Ling energy into the flying sword, stimulating that drop of water essence in the flying sword, the sword presence would reverse against the current and attack the enemy. This move had many difficult places. Like putting in all the Ling energy at one moment into the flying sword. This was a test of a person's control of Ling energy. And stimulating that water essence drop in the flying sword, Suemo didn't dare test it rashly. It had been hard to form this one drop in the first place. If it exploded, Suemo wouldn't just have to reform this water essence drop, but even the inner formations of the ice crystal sword might be damaged. And what Suemo felt the least logical was the presence of this last move. The presence of the previous 6 moves, it flowed, it curved, it spun. But only this last one, Suemo couldn't understand. Going against the current. How could water go against the current? What this, Li Water Sword Scripture, mimicked was water. Suemo understood what kind of water was Li water, but at the end, it was still water. As long as it was water, how could it flow from low places to high places? How could it go against the current and up? But, Li Water Sword Scripture, just had to have this move, and it had to be the last move. When Suemo had been practicing on land, he hadn't felt it. In that case, the water essence drop in the sword had been as light as air. It really couldn't be felt when the sword was swung. But practicing in the water pressure caused the presence of the sword to become heavy as well. The problem that couldn't be seen was magnified. No matter how hard Suemo tried, he just couldn't complete this final move. Whenever he was halfway, he would feel the presence of the sword suddenly falter and could not continue. Adding on that Suemo didn't dare to rashly force the water essence drop in the sword to explode, this sword was even more difficult. Since it was so difficult even in practice, like this, Suemo was stuck on this last move. He could only continue to practice the first 6 moves. As he became more familiar with the first 6 moves, his feeling in the water, especially his feeling of water, became much clearer. The first 6 moves became increasingly smooth. Suemo gradually comprehended it. This feeling was wondrous beyond imagining. It was like looking through a paper window to see the people inside the room. But no matter how hard he tried, he could not poke through that thin paper. Suemo knew, the more it was like this, the more he couldn't rush. This was a sign of a breakthrough. But looking at time slipping away, as it neared the time of the set assessment, Suemo couldn't help but become panicked. He was very clear. His first 6 moves were very familiar, but to use these 6 moves to defeat Luo Li Shixiang, that was just a dream. Sword moves, cultivation, battle experience, both sides weren't on the same level. It wasn't just 10,000 miles that Suemo was behind the other. The only possible way to defeat Luo Li Shixiang was to comprehend the sword essence of Li Water Sword Scripture. Because he knew that Luo Li Shixiang hadn't comprehended sword essence yet. This was the only place he could use. This was also the only place that he won over Luo Li. He had once comprehended sword essence. This was the place that he had gambled everything on. Sword essence, it was hard to describe, intangible, but it became the last trick that Suemo was relying on. If he could not comprehend sword essence, everything else was just a waste. He definitely would lose. Did he really need to use the last move? Suemo couldn't help but hesitate. There was only 7 days until the sect assessment. If he really exploded the water essence this time, and an accident happened, then he wouldn't even have the time to attempt a rescue. The time of 7 days, Suemo wasn't certain if he could still form another whole water essence drop. But quickly, Suemo became stubborn. If he couldn't comprehend Li Water Sword Essence before the sect assessment, then there was no hope of winning over Luo Li Shixiao. Then he would only have one outcome, loss. Taking a risk and failing, it was a loss. Not risking it, it also would be a loss. Suemo gritted his teeth. In any case, the barefoot weren't afraid than those wearing shoes. If he really lost, he wouldn't say anything. He just wasn't as good as the other. He'll just have to pay some contribution points. But that was better than not even having the courage to try, and admitting defeat. In any case, the barefoot wasn't afraid of those wearing shoes. At this point, Suemo's emotions about Luo Li had become faint. This barrier, it was more like a test for himself. And he chose to gamble. He didn't start immediately but entered mediation to recover Ling energy. He decided to be in the best state possible when he tried the move. 6 hours later, Suemo opened his eyes, the light flashing deep in the pupils, serene and steady. He didn't know if it was the fact that he had made a decision, but the effect of the mediation this time was very good. Not only did his Ling energy recover, but the exhaustion of the past days had been swept away. Recovering the best possible state, Suemo stretched out his body. This time, he didn't use his consciousness to control the sword. Rather, he gripped the ice crystal sword with his hand. The ice crystal sword was icy when it entered his hand, like he was gripping an icicle. This bit of coldness followed Suemo's hand and quickly entered Suemo's body. He felt his mind clear. So this sword had such an ability. Suemo couldn't help regret not examining this sword a bit more in the past. But quickly, he calmed his mind. These questions were for the future. Closing his eyes as he gripped the sword and focused, his feet were floating as he stood in the water. The rushing water currents could not affect his body. It was like a piece of wood standing straight in the rushing water, motionless, unspeakably strange. Remembering every detail of practicing these past days, savoring the feeling of the water rushing past the body, feeling the presence of the water essence drop in the flying sword, Suemo relaxed his mind. When everything, all the memories, all the feelings, gathered together, it seemed like a certain nerve in Suemo's head was suddenly plucked by an invisible hand. Suemo suddenly opened his eyes. Li. A deep thunderous sound came out of his chest, the rushing river suddenly stopped. No current, no eddies, the water around Suemo's body seemed to have quieted all of a sudden, motionless. Just at this time, the ice crystal sword that Suemo had been grasping slowly rose up. Suemo's expression looked extremely laborious. The tendons in his forehead were bulging, his eyes angry and wide, his hair standing on end. The ice crystal sword on his hand seemed to weight 1,000 caddies. Just raising it up a bit became extremely hard. What Suemo saw was another picture. When the Ling energy in his entire body flowed like a flood into the ice crystal sword, that water drop which usually was lively, suddenly exploded open. Boom! Suemo's mind shook. He seemed to see that soybean-sized water essence explode into countless water droplets like a mist. Suddenly, Suemo remembered what he had seen in his consciousness, that crimson-red fireball floating in the sky and suddenly exploding. That was so similar to this right now. Manipulate water like fire. This phrase that he had never understood, like lightning, it pierced into his soul. Suddenly, he understood. That thin white paper that had been blocking him all this time was gently broken. A brand new world floated in front of him. In his eyes, those water droplets that formed a mist turned into flames. These flames, it wasn't the red-black flames in his consciousness, but transparent water flames. Flowering, transparent, flames composed out of water. They slowly jumped, clear and colorless. Not as wild and enchanting like the dark red flames in the consciousness. These clear water flames were as serene as the noblewomen in their chambers. They covered the entire body of the ice crystal sword. Suemo's hand that held the ice crystal sword slowly rose. All the river water in the surroundings furiously flowed towards the ice crystal sword, seeming to form a gigantic water flame. Once the strange water flame formed, Suemo's trembling and tired arm quickly became abnormally steady. The sword presence seemed to have lost its reticence and suddenly sped up. Boom! The little ice crystal sword, carrying countless water flames made up of the river water, sliced towards the sky. At the same time, on Wukong Mountain, Xin Yen suddenly opened his eyes. His body flashed, disappearing from his spot and appearing on the cliff of the records room. He looked dazedly at the sky-shaking river below. A flow of water that seemed to form a gigantic flame roared as it flowed up against the sky. The impure river flame, at this time, it was spitting like water, burning and explosive. Who was practicing? To be able to form sword essence, the talent wasn't bad. And such an unique sword essence, he had never seen it before. He could see it clearly. This gigantic water flame, it was restrained by countless sword essences because it was an explosive water bomb. Suddenly, he thought of a certain sword scripture in the records room and his expression changed. Was it a disciple of the sect? Just as he paused, the water flame that had flew up suddenly exploded. At the bottom, Suemo saw the beautiful water flame in the sky. He wanted to laugh, but he had used up all the Ling energy in his body. His eyes suddenly became unfocused. Boom, the water flame exploded in the sky, thousands of caddies of water pouring down. Suemo didn't manage to anchor himself and in the blink of an eye, was flushed away. Chapter 61 Planning. Suemo wiped river water off his face, his steps uneven as he climbed up the shores of the river. He hadn't thought that, Li water burning heavens, would form into a flood and carry him, who had been in a weak state, a few hundred miles away. Li water burning heaven, it had wrung out all the Ling energy in his body. At that time, he didn't even have the energy to breathe, much less get out of the flood. He could only be like a piece of wood and try to stay afloat. Rocks were dense along this sky-shaking river. Suemo had suffered much as he kept on banging into those stones. Not one part of his body was unharmed. A few hundred miles. In terms of distance, it wasn't that far. But Suemo didn't even have a paper crane. As to the female gray-beaked goose, she couldn't be depended on. And his entire body, he only had his pants and no money at all. Collapsing on a rock beside the shore, Suemo weakly panted. But there was joy in his eyes. Sword essence, Lee Water Sword essence. He finally formed Lee Water Sword essence. Even if he only just touched the surface of sword essence and wasn't in any way profound, but as long as he persisted, his skill with this sword scripture would naturally deepen with time. What was even more of a joy to him was the water essence drop inside the ice crystal sword didn't disappear but actually became slightly bigger. It was now about the size of a pinky. He didn't hesitate, struggling up, coiling his legs to meditate. 4 hours later, he opened his eyes and jumped up from the ground. Controlling the ice crystal sword, he started to go through the moves of Lee Water Sword scripture. Previously, his moves had been smooth and connected, right now it seemed traceless. Yet a faint fire-like sword essence spread out, the temperature of the surroundings leaping up. A new world was in front of him. One move after another. His expression solemn, his moves following his thoughts. He could feel that with each move, with the ice crystal sword as the center, a faint water presence would spread. If one looked closely, they would find this water presence was formed from blossoms of extremely tiny water-like flames. In Suemo's consciousness, that ruler-straight ice river had completely transformed. The middle of the river split the river in half, one side full of icicles moving relentlessly, and the other side was countless water flames, silently burning. Suemo felt that he had improved. The Lee Water Sword essence he comprehended this time was completely different than the tidal sword essence he had comprehended before. With the tidal sword essence, rather than saying comprehension, it was more like mimicking. And for Lee Water Sword essence, even though there was Pu Yao's guidance and advice, but he had gone through the entire process by himself bit by bit. The benefits he had received were much more than before. The ice crystal sword flipped and flew, its trajectory traceless, the fire-like sword essence burning. But gradually, Suemo couldn't help but furrow his brows. The Lee Water Sword essence was like fire. The heat that was released would logically increase the power of his sword moves, but to the ice crystal sword, it was a kind of damage. The ice crystal sword was een and cold. It originally was very suited to water element sword scriptures. But what Suemo picked had to be Lee Water Sword scripture, which called for manipulating water like fire. Over time, the grade of this flying sword would probably drop. It looked like that he needed a flying sword suited for him, Suemo muttered inside. He quickly threw the problem to one side. Flying swords were expensive. They weren't something he could buy now. But now that he had comprehended sword essence, the sect, in any case, should give him a flying sword. With the sect's stores, to pick a flying sword suited for him, it shouldn't be too difficult. Manipulating the sword, Suemo didn't feel any tiredness at all but rather extremely refreshed. Even though he was bony and was just wearing some pants, but standing there, he did seem somewhat intimidating. However, the most pressing problem he faced was getting back to the sect. Luckily, it wasn't that far. Even if he had to walk, just a day was enough. Wukong Sword Sect was a mess. In Wukong Hall, people came in and out, everyone was preparing for the sect assessment that was coming in a few days. Inside Wukong Hall, Shifeng Rong faced Xin Yen angrily. You actually watched as he was swept away. There was none of the usual coldness on Xin Yan's face. He carefully said, the circumstances at that time were outside my expectations. I didn't think he would be swept away by the water. When I managed to react, he was already gone. He's a ling plant farmer. If something happened, humph. Shi Fenglong's anger didn't decrease as she snorted icily. Shimmy, don't worry too much. Xin Yen smiled as he comforted, now that he has comprehended sword essence, in this area around Dongfu, where would there be any problems? Hearing this, Shi Fenglong's anger finally decreased. She turned around, did he really comprehend sword essence? 3 months, that's not bad. Which sword scripture did he choose? Empty sword scripture, or shapeless sword scripture? Xin Yen saw Shi Fenglong's face relaxed and released a breath inside. Smiling, he responded, he just entered the inner sect, how could he pick, empty sword scripture, and shapeless sword scripture? What he picked was, Li water sword scripture. I actually hadn't recognized it in the beginning. Hearing this, Shi Fenglong's features tensed again, so what if he just entered the inner sect? How long has Wei Xing entered the inner sect? Humph, Wei Xing is able to enter the sword cave, why can't he choose, empty sword scripture, and shapeless sword scripture? Xin Yen grimaced inside but his mouth went, Wei Xing has outstanding talent, Shi Fenglong broke through, and Zhuo Mo's talent isn't enough. Not good enough talent, in 3 months with no guidance and is able to comprehend sword essence. Go see if anyone else can do it. Even now, Luoli hasn't comprehended sword essence. Yes. Xin Yen was so regretful his intestines were green. Suddenly, the two heard someone come near and they resumed their usual cold composure. Pei Yuanran walked in. Seeing the two, the corners of his mouth rose slightly but then resumed normal. He said, what are second Shidi and Shimmy discussing here? Nothing, Shimmy's disciples Wmo just comprehended sword essence. Xin Yan's face was cool as he replied, no trace remaining of his carefulness just a moment ago. Oh. Pei Yuanran was slightly surprised, he comprehended sword essence. I didn't think he had talent for cultivating the sword. Not bad. Where is he now? This should be rewarded. He was practicing in the river. When he comprehended sword essence, he was swept away by the water. I didn't pay attention and couldn't rescue him. Xin Yen said. That's fine. If Wmo could comprehend sword essence then he doesn't need to worry about safety around Dongfu. Pei Yuanran mused and then said, arrange for some outer sect disciples to search along the river. Make sure he doesn't miss the time of the sect assessment. Yes. Xin Yen answered. Sect leader Shixiang. Shi Fenglong opened coolly. What? Pei Yuanran smiled. Wmo could comprehend sword essence in 3 months, it's enough to show he has talent in the sword. Shi Fenglong said as she stared at Pei Yuanran, if that's the case, the sect should pass on a higher grade sword scripture. Pei Yuanran said, there's no rush, let's discuss this later. Why? Shi Fenglong took a step forwards, demanding. At the side, Xin Yen saw Pei Yuanran being pressured and sympathy formed in his eyes. Pei Yuanran said helplessly, wasn't Shimmy also worried about his birth? Shi Fenglong was silent for a beat. Then she raised her head, saying, when he was entering the inner sect, I was worried about his birth and history. But he is now my disciple. No matter how he was before, I would do my best to guide him. Pei Yuanran and Xin Yen exchanged a look. Both of them were very helpless. Shimmy is reasonable. Pei Yuanran said, but this is really not the time to discuss this matter. I came today to find Shidi and Shimmy for another matter to discuss. Shi Fenglong and Xin Yen waited for him to continue. You have already been informed about the matter of the Dongfu Sword Test Conference. Pei Yuanran's face was grave, this is one point. I hadn't thought that Wmo would do well before but now that he has comprehended sword essence, we should nurture him well. The other matter, Tian Songzi has sent a message. A group of strong cultivators are coming to our Jia to investigate the stars in daytime. Dongfu is one of the 13 primary towns of Sky Moon. We cannot avoid people coming to investigate. We have to control our sect and stop them from getting into trouble in the next while. How many are coming? Xin Yen heard that there were strong people and his pupils shrunk to a needlepoint, his sword essence vibrating. Shitty, don't make a mess. This group is coming down from the upper levels. Pei Yuan Ran said solemnly. Xin Yan's features moved, coming from the upper levels. He then grimaced, looks like this matter has made a really big furor. Everyone knows what's going on. Pei Yuan Ran said, what Tian Song Zi can see, many other people can also clearly see. But right now, the Yao Ma are rising. Who touches first, that's the one that's unfortunate. Speaking, his tone became cold. Luo Li's expression was calm as he stood. In front of him, Qin Cheng's face as serious, shitty, careful. As the words landed, he swept his hand and a dark light shot towards Luo Li. There was a sliver of lightning contained in the dark light, the aura extremely intimidating, with the sound of thunder. What Qin Cheng practiced was, wind and thunder sword scripture. The sword was like wind and thunder, the power frightening. He didn't have as outstanding a talent as Luo Li, but after practicing for a long time, he was extremely solid. When he attacked, the wind and thunder formed. His flying sword was a third-grade black thunder sword. The sword body was thick, containing thunder ore, extremely suited for wind and thunder sword scripture. Due to the weight of the flying sword, Qin Cheng's wind and thunder sword scripture lost a bit of nimbleness and had an additional kind of weight and heaviness. Adding on the lightning flickering, the power actually increased. Luo Li stared at the black light, not dodging, and then the light in his eyes flashed. Ding! A clear sound. The 1,000 heavy black thunder sword actually stopped right in the air. Without any warning, without any decrease in speed, it was like that someone suddenly cast a body paralysis curse on the black thunder sword, pinning it in the air. Qin Cheng's expression changed. He snorted coldly and the paralyzed black thunder sword suddenly jumped, like a fish leaping out of the water. The lightning that had been on the surface of the sword suddenly gathered into a ball and left the sword. As it left the black thunder sword, it turned into a lightning sword. The lightning sword suddenly grew in size in the air, transforming into a gigantic lightning sword that was several feet as it sliced towards Luo Li. Luo Li's expression was serene as he pointed with a finger and swiped gently at the air. Right in front of the gigantic lightning sword, a crack suddenly appeared. It was as though Luo Li's action had broken through space. Without any time for adjustments, the lightning sword ran into the crack. Qin Cheng's face suddenly changed. He lost his connection with the gigantic lightning sword. He was dumbstruck for a few moments. Refocusing, he could not keep his usual calm composure and asked in a trembling voice, Void Sword Scripture, this is Void Sword Scripture. You're tuning into the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.